The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, Lyra Ashvale's life had already changed in ways she had not agreed to. She was in the middle of cleaning a deep cut on a farmer's forearm when her assistant, a young woman named Clara, walked into the healing room with an envelope held between two fingers, as though she were carrying something that might bite. The wax seal on the back was deep red, pressed with the Ashvale family crest, the one Lyra had spent the last 4 years of her life trying to forget. Her stomach dropped before she even touched it. She did not open it in front of the farmer. She wrapped his arm, gave him a small jar of salve, told him to keep it dry for 3 days, and sent him on his way. Only when the door closed did she break the seal. She read it once, then she read it again, slower. Then she set it down on the table, walked to the window, and stared out at the muddy market square of the Eastern Territory town she had chosen specifically because no one here knew her name. The letter was from her father. It was short, which was its own kind of cruelty, because it took him only 8 lines to dismantle everything she had built. She was to be married, not to someone she had chosen, not to someone she had met. She was to be married to Calum Drath, Alpha King of the Northern Crown, as part of a treaty her father had signed on behalf of the Ashvale family, a treaty that apparently included her, though no one had thought to ask. The wedding date was already set. It was 6 weeks away. She stood at the window for a long time. Clara knocked once and opened the door a crack. She took one look at Lyra's face and quietly pulled the door shut again, without saying a word. Lyra had grown up in the Ashvale estate, the second daughter of a family that traded in influence, the way other families traded in grain. Her father, Lord Goran Ashvale, was not a cruel man in the way that people usually meant. He did not shout. He did not raise his hand. He simply made decisions and informed the people involved of them afterward, as though their feelings on the matter were a logistical detail he had already accounted for and dismissed. Her older sister, Petra, had accepted her arranged engagement at 19, with a serene smile and a new wardrobe. Lyra had watched that and decided, quietly and with great certainty, that she would not be doing the same. She had left when she was 20, with a small bag, a set of healer's tools her mother had taught her to use, and enough money to get herself to the Eastern Territories. She had been 23 for exactly 2 months. She had built a practice from nothing. She had a small room above the apothecary, a list of regular patients, and a neighbor named Old Brent who left vegetables outside her door every Thursday because she had once fixed his knee and he felt he owed her a debt that produce could service indefinitely. She was not going to give this up because her father had signed a piece of paper. She burned the letter. She stood at the small iron stove in the corner of the healing room and fed it in edge first and watched it curl and blacken. It smelled like wax and regret. Then she sat down at her work table and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. The Ashvale family's wealth was not her own. The practice she had built was built on rented space, with tools she had purchased on credit extended because of her family name. The Eastern Territory town where she lived sat inside a region that had been quietly destabilized for 3 years by a land dispute between 2 clan lords, and if the Ashvale family withdrew their political neutrality from this region, the consequences would reach every person she treated. She had told herself for years that she had escaped her family. She had not. She had simply moved far enough away that the rope between them had grown long, and she had occasionally mistaken length for freedom. She sat with that for a while. She did not cry. She was not certain she knew how, anymore. By the time Clara knocked again, this time to say that the baker's wife had arrived with a fever, Lyra had made her decision. She was going to go north. She was going to go through the thing, and she was going to find a way out of it that did not destroy the town she had made her home, or the patients who depended on her. She was not going to do this out of obedience. She was going to do this because she was practical, and she was practical because she had learned, slowly and at some cost, that emotion without strategy was just suffering with good intentions. She treated the baker's wife. She treated 4 more patients that afternoon. In the evening, she packed. She was methodical about it. She did not throw things. She did not weep dramatically. She opened her trunk, laid in the clothes she needed, wrapped her tools in their leather roll, and packed the small book of remedies she had been adding to for 3 years, in her own cramped handwriting, in the margins of a much older printed text. She tucked the book in last, pressed flat at the bottom, like the thing she most needed to protect. Clara stood in the doorway and watched. "You're really going," Clara said. It was not quite a question. "I'm going," Lyra said. "To the Northern Crown. Yes. To marry the Alpha King. Apparently." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "I've heard things about him." "So has everyone," Lyra said. "Everyone has heard something different." The stories about Calum Drath were the kind that grew in the telling and contracted in the verification. Depending on whom you asked, he was a tyrant who ruled his clan lords through fear, or a strategist so cold that he had never once been seen to laugh, or a man who had dragged the Northern Crown from near collapse into a functioning kingdom through methods that were effective and morally uncomplicated, and not terribly pleasant to discuss at dinner. Lyra had heard all versions. She was not sure she believed any of them entirely, which was perhaps the closest she had come to actual preparation. She booked passage on the first northbound carriage the following morning. The journey took 8 days. 8 days of roads that started dry and became increasingly difficult, of inns that were progressively colder and progressively less convinced that running water was a necessity, of landscapes that shifted from the familiar flat farmlands of the east into the deep, dark pine territory of the northern regions, where the trees were old and the light between them looked thin and gray and considered. She read on the carriage, she looked out the window, she made notes in the margins of her remedy book about a treatment she had been considering for a specific kind of joint inflammation. She did not think about the wedding if she could help it. There was one other passenger on the final leg of the journey, a merchant named Owen, stout and cheerful, who was delivering fabric bolts to the Northern Crown's palace market. He talked for most of the first day of their shared travel. She answered in short sentences, which most people would have taken as a signal to ease up. Owen was not most people. By the second day, he had learned that she was a healer, that she was going north for family reasons, which she delivered in a tone that closed the subject firmly, and that she preferred the window seat and was not going to negotiate on this. He had also, without being asked, given her more information about the Northern Crown than she had gathered in 8 days of reading. "The Alpha King keeps to himself," Owen said, peeling an orange with his thick thumbs and passing her half without preamble. "Not unfriendly exactly, just not warm. My brother-in-law makes deliveries to the palace twice a year, and he says the staff doesn't fear him, which is unusual, isn't it? Men with that kind of power, the staff usually fears them. What do they feel instead?" Lyra asked, more because the question was interesting than because she was invested in the answer. Owen thought about it. "Careful," he said finally. "Like they're always thinking about what they say, not because he punishes them for saying the wrong thing. More like I don't know, like they take him seriously and they don't want to waste his time." Lyra filed that away in the same mental drawer where she kept information she wasn't ready to draw conclusions about. They arrived at the Northern Crown's outer gates on the morning of the 8th day. She had expected something imposing in the way that power usually announces itself: flags, guards in ceremonial armor, the architecture of intimidation. What she found instead was functional. The gates were enormous because they needed to be. The walls were thick because the winters here were vicious, and the walls did structural work. The guards who checked their papers were efficient and bored in the way of people doing a routine job without fanfare. Owen was waved through with his fabric bolts and gave her a cheerful wave as his cart pulled away. She was met by a palace attendant named Henry, a thin young man with anxious eyes who seemed to have been briefed to expect her, but not specifically told what to do with her once she arrived. He took her trunk. He offered her tea, water, or something stronger, listing the options in a tone that suggested he had been told to say them but had no actual preference about which she chose. She asked for water and followed him into the palace. The Northern Crown's interior was nothing she had prepared herself for. She had expected grandeur of the heavy, self-important kind. Gilded furniture, portraits of fierce ancestors, the kind of decor that was specifically designed to make visitors feel small. Instead, the corridors were clean and high-ceilinged, with large windows that let in the thin northern light. The furniture was old and well-made, and showed evidence of actual use. There were no portraits of imposing ancestors. There was, on the wall of the main corridor, a large and detailed map of the Northern Crown's territories, marked with routes and supply lines and weather patterns. It was the map of a man who was thinking about his kingdom, not performing it. She noticed things like that. She always had. Her mother had called it a gift, and her father had called it a habit, and she suspected it was simply what happened when you spent your childhood in a family where what people said and what they meant were routinely different things. Henry showed her to her rooms. They were on the eastern side of the palace, 3 connected spaces, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small room that had clearly been set up as a workspace, with a long table and shelves and good light. She stood in the doorway of the workspace for a moment and felt something complicated move through her. Someone had thought about what she might need. She was not sure how to feel about that. "The Alpha King will meet with you before dinner," Henry said, "in the Western study. I can take you there at 5. "Thank you," she said. He left. She unpacked her trunk with the same systematic care she had packed it, putting each thing in its place, because this was what she did when she needed to stay calm. She made order in small spaces. She laid her tools out on the long table in the workspace. She put her remedy book on the shelf. She hung her good dress in the wardrobe and told herself she was not nervous, which was technically accurate, in the way that saying, "not raining" is technically accurate during a fog. At 5, Henry returned and walked her through a series of corridors she had not yet mapped, and into the Western study. Calum Drath was standing when she entered. She had not decided in advance what he would look like. She had made a point of not forming an image, because images formed before facts were just guesses with opinions attached, and she had enough of those already. But she was aware, in the seconds between the door opening and her eyes adjusting to the study's lamplight, that whatever she had not been picturing, it had not been this. He was tall, in the way that some people are tall without performing it, the way that a thing is simply the size it is, without apology or announcement. He had dark hair worn short, and the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision-making in equal measure. He was dressed plainly, no crown, no ceremony, no visible armor of any kind. He held a paper in one hand that he set down on the desk as she entered, and he looked at her with eyes that were dark and direct and gave very little away. "Lyra Ashvale," he said. "Calum Drath," she said. There was a brief pause in which neither of them made any effort to soften the silence. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, and then, instead of sitting behind the desk in the position of authority, he moved the chair from the opposite side and sat at the desk's corner, so that they were at a similar angle, not facing off, not side by side, something in between. She noticed that too. "I will tell you how this is going to work," he said. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a man states the terms of something, because stating terms clearly saves time. "The treaty your father signed is politically necessary. I did not make the arrangement with the intention of inconveniencing you, though I understand that it has. You will have your own rooms, which you have seen. You will have freedom to move within the palace and grounds as you choose. If you have a practice, I was told you do, I can arrange space and access within the palace for that work." She had been ready to argue. The arrangements he was describing made it difficult to know where to begin. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "The space for the practice," she said. "Why arrange it?" "Because you use it," he said. "Leaving it idle is a waste." She studied him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "You have no reason to make this easy for me." "Ease isn't the goal," he said. "Function is. I need this alliance to work. You being miserable and resentful is not functional." She had expected many things from the Alpha King of the Northern Crown. She had not expected to be told, plainly and without condescension, that her emotional state was a logistical consideration he had already planned around. She was not sure if she should feel offended by that or relieved. She was, unpleasantly, a little of both. "I want it on record," she said, "that I did not agree to this." "It's already on record," he said. "Your father signed. You did not. I know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without effort, without challenge, without any of the performance she had been steeling herself against. He was simply there, clear-eyed and patient, and it was somehow the most disarming thing anyone had done to her in years. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he agreed. They had dinner that evening, in the smaller of the palace's dining rooms, just the two of them, and the quiet industry of the staff, moving between kitchen and table. She ate. He ate. They did not speak about the wedding. They spoke, briefly and somewhat surprisingly, about water quality in the Eastern Territories, because she had mentioned her practice, and he had asked a specific question about waterborne illness, that led to a longer conversation than either of them had clearly planned. When she went back to her rooms that night and lay down in a bed that was softer than anything she had slept in for years, she stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was still angry. That had not changed. The anger sat in her chest the way it always did, bright and organized and perfectly reasonable. She had every right to it. She intended to keep it. But she had expected this man to be easy to hate, and he was turning out to be a great deal more inconvenient than that. That was, she decided in the dark of the northern night, with its cold light coming through a window she had left cracked out of habit, going to be the actual problem. Lyra did not sleep well in the Northern Crown. This was not a complaint about the bed, which was excellent, or the room, which was warm in the particular thorough way of a building that had been properly insulated against serious winters over many generations. It was that her body had not yet accepted that she was staying. She woke twice in the night, with the specific alert of someone whose muscles were still waiting for a threat. By the third morning she had given up pretending this would resolve itself, and instead rose before the pale northern dawn crept through the window, dressed quickly, and went looking for the palace's kitchen. She found it through a series of wrong turns and one correct one, drawn by the smell of bread. The kitchen was already alive at that hour. 3 people working in the organized silence of people who had shared a space long enough that they did not need to speak. The head cook, a wide and weathered woman named Helen, looked up when Lyra appeared in the doorway, and assessed her in approximately 2 seconds. "You're the healer," Helen said. "Yes," Lyra said. "You want tea? Please." Helen pointed to a stool at the end of the long wooden prep table. Lyra sat on it. A cup of tea appeared in front of her, strong and dark, and then Helen went back to her bread without further conversation, which was exactly what Lyra needed. She sat in the kitchen warmth for half an hour, drinking tea, and watching the morning begin inside a palace she did not yet know how to navigate. The kitchen staff moved around her without fuss. A boy of about 16 named Tom came in to carry a flour sack, and gave her a sidelong look that was not unfriendly, just curious, and then went about his work. This, she thought, was how she would learn this place. Not from the top down, from the formal rooms and official introductions, but from here, from the early morning, and the people who ran it. She went back to her rooms, changed into her working clothes, and began setting up the practice space she had been given. The room was better than she had expected. The shelves were solid and deep. The table was the right height. The light from the large eastern window was good for close work. Someone had stocked it with basic supplies: gauze, clean cloths, a set of ceramic bowls for mixing, a locked cabinet that, when she found the key on the table's edge, turned out to contain a modest but intelligent selection of dried medicines. She stood at the cabinet for a moment and looked at the contents. Whoever had put this together had known something about what a healer actually needed, which was different from what people who didn't know healers thought they needed. She spent the morning organizing. She rearranged the shelves to her own system. She took inventory and made a list of what was missing. She unpacked her own tools and placed them where she could reach them without looking. Henry came at midday with a note from the palace steward, a formal man named Edward, welcoming her and offering her access to the medical records of any palace resident who requested it. She wrote back a one-line reply accepting the offer and sent it with Henry. In the afternoon, she had her first patient. She had not advertised. She had not announced herself. But news of the kind that travels through the corridors and kitchens and staff quarters of a large household moves faster than formal announcements, and by 2 in the afternoon, a young stable hand named Will appeared at her door with a hand that he had wrapped himself in a strip of rough cloth that had done a very poor job of managing what was clearly an infected cut. She unwrapped it, cleaned it properly, mixed a poultice from the cabinet supplies, wrapped it again with actual gauze, properly layered, and told him to come back in 2 days. He thanked her 3 times and left. By the end of the afternoon, she had seen 4 more people. A woman from the laundry with a cough she had been ignoring for 2 weeks. A guardsman with a knee that had not healed correctly after an old injury. A child of about 5 who had been brought by her mother and who sat on the corner of the table with enormous solemn eyes, while Lyra examined a rash on her arm and asked the mother careful questions about diet and bedding and whether the rash spread at certain times of day. The child's name was Selah, and she watched Lyra's hands the whole time with that particular focused attention that very young children give to things they find remarkable. "It's a contact rash," Lyra told the mother. Something she's been touching regularly. I think the wool blanket. The mother blinked. She's had that blanket since she was born. And how long has the rash been there? A pause. About 3 months. Did something change 3 months ago? Did the blanket get washed in a new soap, or stored somewhere different? A longer pause. Then the mother said quietly, "We moved rooms 3 months ago. She'd been sleeping in the old nursery. But after, she stopped. We moved rooms," she said again. Lyra did not push. "Try removing the blanket for a week," she said gently. "If the rash clears, you have your answer." She gave Sela a small piece of dried fruit from a jar on the shelf, more for the child's dignity than for any medical purpose. And Sela accepted it with both hands, and a very grave thank you. After they left, Lyra sat at her table for a moment in the quiet. The child had been in the palace nursery. Then they had moved. The mother had stopped mid-sentence. These were not her mysteries to solve. She was a healer, not an investigator. But she filed the details with the same automatic care she filed everything, because information was how she prepared for things she didn't yet know were coming. She did not see Calum Drath again until the evening. The palace had a practice of shared evening meals on most nights, a habit that Henry explained with the careful neutrality of someone describing a custom they were not sure the newcomer would appreciate. Not all members of the household were required to attend, but it was expected that the Alpha King and, now, his future wife would be present. It was a tradition the Northern Crown had held since Calum's grandfather's time, a deliberate choice to keep the household from fracturing into factions and isolated loyalties. Lyra sat at a long table with approximately 14 other people, ranging from senior advisors to the master of the stables. Calum sat at the head. He did not behave differently at the table than he had in his study. The same attention, the same lack of performance, asking the master of stables about a horse that had been limping since the previous week, listening to the answer with genuine interest. He asked Lyra, across the table and without preamble, how she had found the practice space. "It's good," she said, because it was, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "What's missing?" he asked. "I've made a list," she said. "Give it to Henry. He'll have it sourced." She had expected, she realized, small negotiations, small demonstrations of power, the petty management of her access to things she needed in a place where he had all the authority. She had prepared for it the way you prepare for cold weather, with layers and a certain grim determination to endure. He was not doing any of it. She could not decide if this was genuinely decent behavior or a very sophisticated form of control she hadn't identified yet. After dinner, the household dispersed in the comfortable way of people long accustomed to one another. Lyra stayed at the table for a few minutes after most people left, because the advisor seated beside her, a woman named Margaret, had begun asking her pointed and genuinely interesting questions about treatment approaches for a recurring condition that affected her shoulder, and Lyra found herself talking about it with more enthusiasm than she had intended. When she finally stood to go, she found that the room had emptied except for her and Margaret, and, at the far end of the table, Calum, who was reading a report with a cup of cold tea at his elbow, and had apparently made no move to leave. He looked up when she stood. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, and went back to the report. It was such an ordinary exchange. She went to her rooms and thought about that for longer than it deserved. The next days settled into a strange rhythm. She ran her practice. She ate in the kitchen in the mornings, and at the long table in the evenings. She learned the palace's geography through deliberate walks in the hours between patients, mapping it the way she had mapped the Eastern Territory town she had arrived in 4 years ago, noting where the useful things were, where the bottlenecks were, where the corridors were dark or the staircases uneven. She was walking one of these routes, through the lower eastern corridor, when she found the hallway outside what turned out to be the steward's office, and stopped. Through the open door she could hear a conversation. She was not eavesdropping. She had stopped because she had heard a specific cadence in the voices, not the cadence of casual talk, but the cadence of someone in distress trying to manage it. One of the voices was Edward, the steward. The other was a young man she had seen twice in the upper corridors. Edward was saying, quietly and without harshness, that the records showed a medication had been prepared incorrectly twice in the previous month, and that this was not a small error, and that he needed to understand how it had happened. The young man's voice was controlled in the way of someone controlling it through effort. Lyra walked on. This was not her business. But she took note of it, because this was the kind of thing that was her business in the broader sense. The gap between the care that was being offered in this palace and the systems supporting it, which were not as organized as the physical spaces suggested. She had been here less than a week. She was already seeing the edges of things. She mentioned it to Calum the following evening. Not about the conversation she had overheard. She would not do that to the young man, but about what it suggested. She waited until after dinner, when the table had mostly cleared, and he was in his usual habit of reading while the tea went cold, and she sat down 2 seats away from him with her remedy book open and said, without looking up, "Your medical supply records are being kept in 2 different places with no cross-reference. I've seen it in my own practice space, and I suspect it runs through the larger household." He looked up. "That's how errors happen," she said. "Not from carelessness, from systems that don't connect." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have a solution?" "A single centralized record. I can design the format. I'd need someone with enough authority to require the other departments to contribute to it." He considered her for a long moment. Not the way a man considers a proposal. More the way a man considers the person who made it. She held the look without shifting. "Edward can be that authority," Calum said. "Talk to him tomorrow. Tell him I asked you to." She nodded and went back to her book. She heard him set his report down on the table. She did not look up. "You've been here 5 days," he said. "Yes," she said. "You've seen the supply record problem in 5 days." "I tend to notice things," she said. "I know," he said. There was something in his voice that might have been dry amusement, and might have been something else. "I've been told." She looked up then. He had already picked his report back up. She thought about asking what he meant by that. Who had told him? What they had said? She decided not to. She went back to her book. This, she was learning, was what daily life with Calum Drath actually looked like. Not dramatic confrontation. Not cruelty. Not the performances of authority she had steeled herself against. It was this. Functional, direct, oddly quiet. He treated her the way he treated the master of stables and the senior advisors, with the assumption that she was competent and worth listening to. She had been prepared for an enemy. She had packed arguments the way you pack tools, with care and with the intention of using them, and none of it had been necessary yet, and this was making her angrier than cruelty would have, because she could fight cruelty. She did not know what to do with a man who was simply trying to make something work. She was sitting in the kitchen 3 mornings later. It had become a habit, the morning tea with Helen and the early quiet, when Helen set a second cup down on the table without being asked, and said, without preamble, "He's not what they say." Lyra looked at her. "The stories," Helen said. "He's not what they say. I've been in this kitchen for 19 years. I knew his father. I know the difference." She picked up her bread paddle and went back to the oven. "That's all I'm saying." Lyra wrapped both hands around her cup. She did not ask what the difference was. She thought she was already beginning to see it, and that, more than anything that had happened since she had arrived, was what made her sit very still in the kitchen warmth, and feel something shift, very quietly, underneath all the anger she was holding on to. She was not going to let it shift. She was going to hold on to the anger with both hands, because she was not ready to look at what was underneath it. But she felt it, and she knew that was how it began. The wedding was announced formally on a Wednesday morning. Lyra found out from Henry, who brought a note to her practice room while she was in the middle of writing up a treatment record for the stable hand Will, whose hand had improved considerably, and who had taken to stopping by to report this improvement with a level of personal satisfaction she found disproportionate and entirely endearing. She read the note, while Will described the lack of itching, with great enthusiasm. "That's very good," she said to Will, about the itching, and set the note down on the table where it sat like a quiet accusation. The wedding was in 4 weeks, a Thursday. The note from the palace's protocol office detailed the schedule. A formal ceremony in the Great Hall, witnessed by representatives of 6 clans, followed by a reception that would last most of the evening. She was informed that a dressmaker would attend her the following morning to discuss attire. She told Will to keep the hand dry and showed him the door. Then she sat at her table and looked at the note for a long time. She had known this was coming. She had known since the letter in the Eastern Territories, since the carriage journey north, since the first evening in the Western study when Calum had laid out the terms with his characteristic lack of drama. She had known, and she had managed it, by not quite fully thinking about it, by staying busy, by making the practice useful, by learning the palace from the kitchen up. But 4 weeks was 4 weeks. It had a specific weight. She thought about Petra, her sister, who had married at 19 with that serene smile. She thought about her mother, who had never, in Lyra's memory, expressed an opinion about her father's decisions, without first calculating what it would cost her to do so. She thought about the small room above the apothecary, in the Eastern Territories, with the thin mattress, and the neighbor's vegetables, and the morning light, coming through the one east-facing window. She thought about the way Calum had said, "I know the difference," when she had told him she hadn't agreed to this. She picked up her pen. She went back to writing Will's treatment record. She was careful, and thorough, and precise, and she did not stop until the record was done, because the record mattered, and it needed to be correct, and it was something she could control. The dressmaker came the next morning. Her name was Frances, a no-nonsense woman with a measuring tape around her neck, and the manner of someone who had made formal attire for palace events for long enough that she had lost patience for overthinking any of it. She took Lyra's measurements with professional efficiency, asked 2 questions about color preference, to which Lyra gave answers that she suspected Frances noted and largely intended to improve upon, and left with a set of fabric samples under her arm. Lyra stood in the middle of her sitting room after Frances left and thought, "This is real." She had been thinking of the wedding as a future problem, a logistical event to be managed at the appropriate time. She was good at that, holding things at exactly the distance that made them manageable, and not 1 inch closer. It was a skill she had developed young and refined with practice. But Frances had taken her measurements, the specific circumference of her waist and the length of her shoulders, and the span of her arms. Her body was being built into this event now. That made it real, in a way that the decree, and the note, and even the conversations with Calum had not. She went for a walk. She went through the main corridors, and the east wing, and then, on an impulse she didn't examine, down through the back passage that led to the lower grounds. The Northern Crown's grounds were wide and cold, with the kind of beauty that required you to be dressed for it. Dark stone paths through grass that had gone the pale gold of late season. Old trees with deep root systems that had buckled the path edges in places. A view of the mountains to the north that were dusted with the first of the season's snow. She walked until she was warm from the movement, and her breath was visible in the air. She stopped at a low stone wall that bordered the kitchen gardens, and looked at the mountains. She was angry. She knew that. She had permission to be. No one had asked her. Her father had used her name, and her blood, and her legal status, as a member of the Ashvale family, like currency in a transaction she had no voice in. And the fact that the person on the other side of that transaction was turning out to be reasonable and decent and genuinely more complicated than the story suggested did not change the fundamental nature of what had been done. But anger alone was not enough. She knew that too. She needed a strategy, not an escape. She had done the arithmetic on escape that first night in the Eastern Territories, and it did not work. But an arrangement she could live in, a version of this that was hers, in some real sense, even if the frame had been built without her. She thought about the practice. She thought about Sella and the wool blanket. She thought about Will's hand and the supply record problem, and the morning teas with Helen, and the long dinner table, where people talked about real things. She could build something here. She could make this space hers. She would not be happy about the way she had arrived in it, but she could work with what it was. She turned and walked back to the palace. Calum was crossing the main courtyard as she came in from the grounds. He saw her and stopped. "You were walking," he said. This was not a question but an observation, and she had begun to understand that his observations were a form of attention. He noticed, and he said what he noticed, plainly, without ornamentation. "I was," she said. He looked at her for a moment. He was holding a folder of papers under one arm, and wearing a coat that suggested he had recently been outside himself, though he did not say so. "The protocol office sent you the wedding notice," he said. "This morning." He seemed to consider whether to continue. Then he said, "If there are aspects of the ceremony that you want changed, tell me before the end of the week. Some things can't be adjusted, the witness list, the formal structure, but other elements can. Such as, the vows are customarily long, he said. There's a traditional version and a shorter version. I was planning to use the shorter one, but if you have a preference. The shorter one, she said immediately. Something moved in his expression. It might have been relief. Good, he said. The traditional one has 37 lines. She blinked. 37. My great-grandmother is reported to have cried through most of it, he said, and turned and went back toward the inner corridors. She stood in the courtyard for a moment. He had just made a joke, a very dry, very brief, very controlled joke, but a joke nonetheless, about his great-grandmother, about the vows. She had not expected that from him. She added it to the collection of things about him that did not fit the stories, and did not fit her preparation, and refused to stay in the drawer where she was trying to keep them. She went back inside. 4 weeks passed, the way time passes when you are dreading the end of it, too quickly in the middle, and with a strange, slow wait at the edges. She treated her patients. She rebuilt the supply record system with Edward's cooperation, and a great deal of initial resistance from 2 of the department heads, who came around when it became clear she was not going to stop asking until they did. She added 3 new medicines to her cabinet from the sourced list Henry had processed without comment. She had 7 separate conversations with Calum over those 4 weeks, in addition to the shared dinners. 6 of them were about palace matters, the supply records, a question he had about a treatment approach he had read about, a brief exchange about the Southern Territories that she had started by asking a question she hadn't planned to ask out loud. One of them was not about palace matters at all. That one happened 9 days before the wedding, late in the evening, when she had gone to the library to return a borrowed map and found him there, sitting in one of the library's large chairs, with a book open in his lap that he was not reading. He was looking at the fire. He didn't hear her come in. She almost left without speaking. Instead, she said, "Are you all right?" He looked up. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, which was the first time she had seen him anything other than fully composed. "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause that was a fraction too long, "It's the anniversary of something. I tend to sit in here on this particular evening." She did not ask what anniversary. She nodded. She returned the map to the shelf where she had found it. She stood at the shelf for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the map titles without really reading them. Then she said, "I'll leave you to it," and left. She walked back to her rooms and sat on the edge of her bed, and thought about the look on his face when she had asked if he was all right. Not the words, the look, the thing that was in his eyes for the fraction of a second before the composure came back. She had seen that look before. Not on him. On people in her practice. People who were carrying something they had carried so long it had stopped feeling like a weight, and started feeling like a part of their own body. People who were so good at managing their grief that they forgot to notice it was still there, until someone asked a simple question in a quiet room. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. She was still angry. She reminded herself of that. She had every right to be angry, and she was going to stay that way. But she was also, she realized in the dark of her northern room, beginning to understand that there were things about this man that no story had prepared her for, and that the things she had not been prepared for were going to be far more difficult to navigate than anything she had imagined on the carriage north. The morning of the wedding, Lyra woke before the dawn and lay flat on her back staring at the ceiling of her room in the Northern Crown, with the specific alertness of someone who has not slept deeply enough for their body to feel rested, but has slept too long to go back under. She got up. She did not pace. She had no patience for pacing. Instead, she went to her practice room and reorganized the upper shelf, which did not need reorganizing, and then wrote 3 notes in her remedy book about treatment ideas that had come to her in the half-sleep of the previous night, and then sat at the long table in the gray pre-dawn, with her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, and let herself be honest about what she was feeling. She was frightened. She did not like being frightened. She had a long and practiced method of converting fear into preparation, which served her well as a healer, and had served her reasonably well as a person who had made difficult decisions in difficult circumstances. But she was sitting in a palace she had not chosen, on a morning that was going to change her legal status forever, and the conversion was not working today. Helen found her there when the kitchen came alive at 5:30. The older woman appeared in the doorway of the practice room, took one look at Lyra's face, and disappeared. She returned 5 minutes later with a cup of actual hot tea, a thick slice of buttered bread, and a small dish of preserved plum that she set down without ceremony. "Eat," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Lyra ate. By 8 o'clock, Francis had arrived with the dress. It was gray-blue, the color of northern sky in the hour before cloud cover, and it was more beautiful than Lyra had expected. Francis had done something to the fabric at the sleeves and the collar that made it look like it had been designed specifically for someone who was trying to be present at a formal event without being consumed by it. Elegant, but not elaborate. Composed without being cold. She put it on. She looked at herself in the long mirror in the corner of the bedroom and thought, "This is the woman who is getting married today." The woman in the mirror looked back at her with calm eyes and good posture and a set to her jaw that Lyra recognized as the external version of the held breath she had been taking since Tuesday morning. Francis made 2 small adjustments with pins, declared the result acceptable in the tone of a woman for whom acceptable was high praise, and left. Henry came at 9 to take her to the preparation room adjacent to the Great Hall. She walked through the palace corridors in her gray-blue dress and her healer's posture, and did not think about the fact that the corridors were lined, at intervals, with people she had learned the names of over the past 6 weeks. Helen's kitchen staff, Will from the stables, Margaret who had asked her about the shoulder condition over dinner, old Edward who had initially resisted the supply record system and then become its most meticulous keeper. They did not crowd, they did not make noise, but they were there, and several of them looked at her as she passed with expressions that contained something she had not prepared for, which was genuine warmth. She kept walking. The preparation room was small and quiet, with a window that looked out onto the kitchen gardens. She stood at the window for the 20 minutes before the ceremony and watched 2 pigeons conduct a long negotiation over a piece of bread crust. It was, in that 20 minutes, the most important thing she had ever watched. Then Henry opened the door and said quietly, "It's time." The Great Hall of the Northern Crown was not built for ceremony in the ornate sense. It was built for use. High ceilings for air circulation, wide doors for the movement of large numbers of people, stone walls that kept the cold out and the sound in. It had been arranged for today, with long rows of chairs and flowers that were the deep blue-purple of the northern regions in their short summer, already dried to a darker shade and arranged in clusters along the walls. The witnesses were seated. 6 clan representatives, 3 from the Northern Crown's own territory and 3 from the outside alliances that had made this marriage politically necessary. She saw them from the entrance and noted their faces without meeting their eyes. Calum was already at the front of the hall. She walked down the aisle. She had decided, sometime in the weeks before this day, that she was going to walk it alone. She had a father who should have been there and wasn't, not because he was dead or unavailable, but because she had made a clear and deliberate choice not to invite him into the one moment of this that she could actually control. She had written him a note explaining this. She imagined his expression when he read it. She had not felt guilty about that. So she walked alone, at her own pace, and she did not look at the witnesses on either side, and she did not perform anything. She simply walked. Calum watched her come. He was dressed formally for the first time since she had arrived. Dark fabric, nothing excessive, but with the bearing of someone who occupied authority without needing to decorate it. He did not look away as she approached. He had the quality, she had noticed before, of giving his full attention to whatever was in front of him, and today, what was in front of him was her, and she felt that attention the way you feel direct sunlight, aware of it, without quite being able to look at it. She reached the front of the hall. She stood beside him. The officiant, a senior council member named Philip, gray-haired and professionally solemn, began the ceremony. Calum had been right. The short version was mercifully brief. Philip spoke about the alliance between the Northern Crown and the Ashvale family, about the meaning of the bonds being formed, about obligation and honor and the joining of 2 histories. It had the quality of language that had been used so many times, in so many ceremonies, that it had become smooth from handling, like a stone in a riverbed. She listened to her cues. When Philip reached the vows, she and Calum turned to face each other. This was the first time she had looked at him directly since entering the hall. He was looking at her, not through her, not past her at the witnesses, not at the officiant. At her, with those dark, direct eyes that she had been navigating for 6 weeks and still had not fully mapped. She said her vows. She did not mean them. She had decided that in advance, and she was at peace with it. These were legal words, contractual language, and she treated them as such. But when she said them clearly and without stumbling, because she was not going to give anyone in this hall the satisfaction of watching her falter. He said his. His voice was the same as it always was, low, precise, without performance. He did not look away from her face for the duration of his vows, not once, not even when Philip moved to the part about lifelong commitment, which was the longest and most weighted line. His voice did not change. His eyes did not change. She thought, he means them even less than I do. And then Philip declared them married, and the witnesses applauded, and Calem's expression did the very slight, very controlled thing that she had come to understand, was the closest he got to public softness, and she realized, standing in the great hall of the Northern Crown, with her hands at her sides, and her gray-blue dress, and the dried northern flowers, and the pale light through the high windows, that she could not actually tell if he meant them or not. The reception was its own endurance. She was good at events. Not in the way of people who enjoy them, she did not enjoy them, but in the way of people who have learned that an event is just a sustained performance, with a beginning and an end, and the key to surviving it is to focus on the end. She ate one plate of food from the long reception table. She drank one glass of wine, the good dark kind that the Northern Crown's valleys apparently produced in quantities sufficient to supply the palace generously. She spoke to every person she was required to speak to, and several she chose to speak to because they were genuinely interesting, and the alternative was standing by a wall watching other people have conversations. The clan representative from the Eastern Alliance, a woman named Ruth who had sharp eyes and a forthright manner, cornered her near the dessert table and asked her directly what she thought of the alliance. Lyra said, with equal directness, that she thought it was politically intelligent and personally complicated, and Ruth laughed, a short, surprised sound, and said that was the first honest thing anyone had said to her all day. She lost track of Calem in the middle part of the evening. He was doing his own circuit of the room, which required more stops and more conversation than hers, and she noticed at some point that he had been in the same conversation with two of the clan representatives for quite a long time, and that his face during this conversation had the quality of a man maintaining composure through something that required effort. She did not go to him. It was not her place, or it was her place now, technically and legally, but the technicality and the reality were different countries, and she was not ready to try to navigate between them in a hall full of witnesses. At midnight, she said her calculated and final good night to the last person on her list and went to her rooms. She sat on the edge of her bed in the gray-blue dress, too tired to change, too much in her head to sleep, and stared at the floor. She was married now. That was the fact she kept turning over, not because it was surprising, but because the reality of it had a different texture than the idea of it had. Married to a man she had arrived expecting to despise, and had instead found entirely too complicated to manage with a simple emotion. Married in a ceremony she had not chosen, in a place she had not chosen, but with a dress she had been consulted about, and vows she had been offered a choice about, and a walk she had been allowed to take alone. She sat for a long time. Then she heard, very faintly, from somewhere in the palace, not from the reception hall, which was on the opposite side of the building, but from somewhere closer, one of the interior corridors, a child's voice. She could not make out words, just the sound of it, thin and tired, the kind of sound a child makes when they are too old to cry and too young to not need to. She changed into her practical clothes. She picked up her healer's satchel. She followed the sound. It led her to a corridor on the north side of the palace's inner wing, outside a door she had not opened before. The sound was clearer here, not crying, but the unsteady breathing of someone who had been crying and stopped. She knocked. Silence. "Sela," she said quietly. "It's Lyra, the healer. Can I come in?" A pause, then, very softly, "Yes." She opened the door. The room was dim, lit by one small lamp. Sela was sitting upright in the center of a large bed, with the wool blanket that Lyra had told her mother to remove, folded at the foot of the bed, and the child's arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were dry but red-rimmed, and she was wearing an expression of determined composure that was the most heartbreaking thing Lyra had seen in a long time, because it was the expression of a child who had learned very young to hold herself together. "The rash is better," Sela said, in a voice that was doing its best to be normal. "I can see that. Lyra said. Good. How are you? Sela thought about this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old who takes questions literally. Loud, she said finally. Lyra sat down in the chair beside the bed. What do you mean? The party, Sela said. It's loud. I could hear it all evening. I don't like loud very much. I know the feeling, Lyra said. Sela looked at her carefully. You were at the party. I was. Was it loud for you? Very, Lyra said. Sela seemed to find this meaningful. She uncurled slightly, just enough that the posture of determined composure gave way to something more ordinary and tired. They sat together in the quiet room, while the distant sounds of the reception faded further into the palace walls, and Lyra told Sela, in a low and unhurried voice, about the 2 pigeons and their argument over the bread crust that morning in the kitchen gardens. She described the negotiation in detail, which pigeon had the better claim, what tactics each had used, the eventual resolution. Sela listened with her eyes going heavier, and by the time Lyra reached the conclusion of the story, the child was asleep. Lyra sat for a few minutes in the chair. She looked at this small person sleeping in the large bed, and she thought about the things the mother had not said. She thought about what it meant to be a child who had learned that composure was safer than falling apart. She set the lamp on its lowest setting. She left the door slightly open so the hallway light could reach the room. She walked back to her own rooms in the quiet of the late-night palace and changed into her nightclothes and finally lay down in the bed. She was married. She had sat tonight with a child who was learning, too young, to carry herself alone. She did not know yet what any of it meant. She did not know what the next month looked like, or the next year, or the shape of the life she was building inside this one she had not chosen. She was not going to figure it out tonight. She closed her eyes. She thought about gray-blue fabric and 37 lines of vows and the thin sound of a child's voice in a dark corridor. She slept. 3 days after the wedding, the palace returned to itself. This was the part no one in the stories ever talked about, the ordinary morning after the extraordinary event. The clan witnesses departed on Wednesday. The reception decorations were taken down by Thursday. The dried flowers were removed from the Great Hall, which resumed its usual work as the main gathering space for daily palace business, and life contracted back to its normal size. Lyra resumed her practice. She had patients waiting. Will's hand had reached the point where she could sign off on it, which she did with the specific quiet satisfaction of a completed treatment, and told him she expected she would see him in the future with some other injury given the nature of his work, and he accepted this assessment with cheerful resignation. The woman from the laundry with the cough had improved, but not enough, so Lyra adjusted the treatment and was more direct this time about the need for rest, which the woman received with the expression of someone who had heard this before and was still not entirely sure she believed it applied to her. Edward came to her practice room on Thursday morning with a question about the supply record system that led into a longer conversation about the palace's general medical preparedness, which was the first conversation she had had in the Northern Crown, where she felt she was talking with someone who was genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply being polite. Edward was older, precise, with the quality of a person who had managed complexity for a long time, and knew that most problems revealed themselves most clearly in the records. "We've never had a dedicated healer in residence," he said. "I know," she said. "It shows in some of the older records." He looked at her with something that might have been sheepish if he were the kind of man who did sheepish. "I take it you've found some things." "A few," she said, with deliberate understatement, because there was no point in leading with every observation at once. She had learned that from her father, in the reverse. He had always led with everything at once, which meant that people never knew which thing to address first, and most of them addressed nothing. She gave Edward 3 specific observations. He took notes. He left and came back 4 hours later with information that addressed 2 of them, and a question about the third. She liked him. She had not expected to like very many people here. Calum came to her practice room on Friday afternoon. This was unusual. He had not come to her space before. Their interactions had all been in the dining room, the library, the corridors between things. He knocked on the open door and stood at the threshold, which she also noted, because the space was hers, and he was treating it accordingly. "Do you have a moment?" he said. "Yes," she said, and gestured to the stool across from her work table. He sat. He was carrying nothing. which was unusual for him. He almost always had papers somewhere about his person. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and looked at her for a moment, and she waited. A report came in from the southern border this morning, he said. 3 villages in the South Pass have not received supply routes in 7 months. I was aware of 1 month's delay. I was not aware it had compounded. She looked at him. He was telling her this. He did not have to tell her this. How many people, she said. The 3 villages combined, perhaps 1,200. Mostly farming families. The road has been technically open. The delay has been a coordination failure between 2 departments that report separately, and each assumed the other had managed the last delivery. What are the consequences so far? We don't fully know. The report is from a traveler, not an official. I'm sending someone tomorrow morning to assess. When you say assess, she said carefully, what does that include? The material shortages, the state of the roads, whether the situation has reached a point that requires an immediate emergency response, beyond the restoration of the regular supply route. She reached for her remedy book. The timing is late season. If there are children under 5 in those villages, or elderly people, or anyone who was already in poor health before the shortage began, 7 months of reduced supply will have left them vulnerable to the winter illnesses. Your assessor should be looking specifically at those populations. He was quiet for a moment. Will you write down what to look for? He said. She turned to a clean page and wrote. She wrote quickly, in the organized shorthand she used for her own notes, and then she paused and rewrote it in full sentences because the person reading it would not have her context. She wrote for 10 minutes. She tore the pages out and handed them across the table. He read them. He read them fully. Not the skim of someone performing attention, but the actual reading, of someone taking in information. Thank you, he said. Send the assessor to me before they leave, she said. I can give them a medical supply kit and walk them through what to prioritize. He nodded. He stood, and then paused at the threshold on the way out. The supply coordination failure, he said. Edward says you've already identified a records problem. Is this related? Yes, she said. The same structural issue at a different scale. He nodded again. He left. She sat at the table for a moment. There was something she was beginning to understand about Calum Drath that she had not anticipated from the stories and had only begun to see clearly in the weeks since her arrival. He did not separate the personal from the political in the way that powerful people usually did, where the personal was something that happened in the margins and the political was the main event. He did not segment his concern. When she had told him about the supply records, he had acted. When she raised the southern villages tonight, he told her. Not because he needed her help, specifically, but because the information belonged to the conversation they were building, and he was building it. She did not know what to do with a person who thought like that. She had built her understanding of powerful men, her father, the clan lords she had treated during the border disputes in the Eastern Territories, the various officials she had navigated, around the assumption that power created distance, that the further up you went, the more reality was abstracted away from you. Calum was not abstracted. He was stubbornly, inconveniently present in everything he did. She closed her remedy book. She looked out the window at the late afternoon light on the northern stone. She was married to this man. That fact was still doing something strange to her internal landscape, still unsettling the ground she had thought she had her footing on. She was married to a man she had arrived ready to resent, and had instead spent 6 weeks finding increasingly difficult to reduce to something simple. He was difficult to hate. He was also, she admitted to herself in the privacy of her practice room with the light going gold outside, difficult to understand at a glance, which meant she kept having to look. The assessor came to her the next morning. A capable young man named Nathan, earnest and well-organized, who listened carefully to everything she said and asked intelligent follow-up questions, and departed with the medical supply kit she had packed him, and her written list of priorities. She watched him ride out from the kitchen window. Helen appeared beside her with tea. He'll be thorough, Helen said, nodding at Nathan's retreating figure. He was a good student. Yours? Lyra asked. The King's, Helen said. He was one of the first young men the King put through the officer training after the Northern Campaign. He has a habit of teaching people and then giving them things to do. She poured her own tea. Some of those young people are now running departments. Some of them left and built things in their own towns. He doesn't require them to stay, just to learn. Lyra held her cup. You're telling me this on purpose, she said. Helen's expression did not change. I'm telling you about Nathan, she said. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. Helen went back to her bread. Lyra drank her tea and thought about a man who taught people and then released them, who built things he did not require credit for, who sat in the library on a specific evening with a book open in his lap that he was not reading, and who said, "It's the anniversary of something," and offered nothing more, and who had spent the entire duration of their first wedding ceremony looking at her face with those direct, unreadable eyes that she was learning to read, a little at a time, the way you read a map of terrain you are currently walking. She was not revising her position. She was not letting go of the anger, or the complications, or the fundamental injustice of what had been done to her. But she admitted to herself, as Helen's kitchen filled with warmth, and the sound of dough being worked on the board, beginning to understand that this man, and the story she had been given about him, were two very different things. And that what came next, what she chose to build inside this marriage she had not asked for, was now, slowly and irrevocably, becoming her own. The Northern Crown had a system for everything, and most of those systems were broken in quiet ways that no one had fully noticed until Lyra started looking. She was not looking for problems. She was doing her work, treating her patients, keeping her records, attending the shared dinners, and the occasional formal meeting that her new status apparently required. And the problems were simply there, visible to someone with her particular habit of attention, the way a slightly wrong note is visible to someone who knows music. She had been in the palace for 2 months when she started writing them down. Not a formal report, a private list, the kind she made in the margins of her remedy book when she noticed something she wasn't yet ready to address. A note to herself, a marker, so that she could come back to it when she had the full shape of the thing. But the list grew, and as it grew she began to see that what she was looking at was not a collection of separate problems but one single problem with many faces. The Northern Crown was a kingdom that had been rebuilt very quickly, from near collapse, by a single person who had made correct decisions faster than the infrastructure could keep up with them. She understood this only slowly. She was not a political strategist. She was a healer, and she thought like one, in systems, in causes and effects, in the distance between what a patient's surface symptoms showed and what was actually happening in the deeper tissues. What she saw in the Northern Crown, when she looked at it that way, was a body that had survived a serious illness and healed fast, and was now running on a level of output that its recovery had not fully prepared it for. She brought none of this to Calum directly. Not yet. She was still mapping. What she brought to him were the specific, concrete things, the medication error patterns she had traced through Edward's new records, the gaps in care for the lower staff that came from having no dedicated healer on site before her arrival, the 3 separate cases she had seen of injuries that had been treated improperly in the past and had calcified into chronic conditions that were now harder to address than they would have been at the time. He received each thing the same way he received everything, with full attention and a question. The questions were always the specific kind, not "what do you suggest," which was the question of a man looking to be told what to do, but the kind that went a level deeper. Why there and not somewhere else? Or, what does that pattern tell you about the cause? Or, once, while they were both standing in the corridor outside the medical supply cabinet and she was explaining the cross-referencing issue, if you were building this from nothing, what would you keep and what would you cut? She had answered that last one for 20 minutes before she noticed how much she had said. He had listened to all of it. This was the thing she kept returning to in the evenings, in her practice room, or in the quiet of her sitting room before sleep. The fact of him listening. She had grown up around powerful people, and powerful people listened in a specific way that was not quite listening at all. They waited for the part that was relevant to them, and filtered out the rest, and the filtering was visible if you knew where to look. Her father did it. The clan lords she had dealt with did it. Even most of the advisors she had met in the palace did it. Calum did not filter. When she spoke, he listened to the whole thing. When she was done, he responded to what she had actually said, not to his interpretation of what she had probably meant. This was such a specific and unusual quality that she kept waiting for the version of it that was performance, the moment where the careful attention revealed itself as a technique rather than a character, and it did not come. She mentioned this to Margaret, obliquely, one evening after dinner, when the two of them had stayed to finish a conversation about Margaret's shoulder that had begun productively and wandered into more interesting territory. "He listens," Lyra said, and immediately felt that she had made this sound simple when she had meant it to be complicated. Margaret looked at her with the expression of someone who had been in this palace for a long time and found the observation accurate but obvious. "He always has," Margaret said. "His father didn't. His father was a man who heard what he wanted and filled in the rest. Calum watched that for 20 years and decided to do the opposite." Lyra considered this. "His father's decisions," she said, "were they?" "Some were good," Margaret said, "in the way that self-interested decisions sometimes produce good outcomes by accident. Most were expensive." She picked up her wine. "The Northern Campaign was his father's plan. It went wrong in ways his father did not live to fix. Calum fixed them." She did not say more than that. Margaret was, Lyra had learned, a woman who said exactly as much as the conversation needed and considered anything beyond that a form of waste. Lyra went back to her rooms and thought about fathers. She had her own complicated arithmetic on the subject. Her father was not a man she hated, exactly. Hate required a specific kind of investment she had decided, at some point in her early 20s, not to make. But he was a man whose decisions had shaped her life, in ways she had spent years working to undo. And the fact that she was now in the Northern Crown, married to a man her father had selected for her like a piece in a strategy game, was a daily reminder that the undoing was not complete. She had not spoken to her father since before the wedding. She had received one letter, brief and formal, conveying congratulations in the tone of a man completing a transaction. She had read it once and put it in the small locked drawer in her bedroom, where she kept the things she was managing rather than engaging with. She thought, in the dark, about two different men who had two different fathers, about the way the shape of a parent's decisions could become the interior geography of a life. She fell asleep before she could follow that thought anywhere. The next morning, Nathan returned from the southern villages. He came to her practice room first, before making his full report to Calum, which was perhaps protocol and perhaps something else. She did not ask. She accepted the fact that he came to her because she had sent him with a specific medical brief, and he considered it correct to return to her with his medical findings before the political ones. "How bad?" she said. "Not as bad as the worst scenario," he said. "Better than the middle one." He sat down on the stool and pulled out his own notes. "The road access has been adequate for basic goods. What failed was the medical supply chain specifically. Medicines, wound care, the fever management kits. Winter goods are there. Food is low but not critical. Children? 4 children under 3, with respiratory infections that were not caught early enough. Manageable now, but needed to have been caught a month ago." He looked at his notes. 2 elderly people, who are genuinely worrying. 1 woman, who was already managing a chronic lung condition, and has had no access to her usual treatment for 3 months. Lyra took the notes from him and read them herself. She asked questions. He answered them. They worked through the medical picture systematically, and by the end, she had a list of what needed to go south in the next supply cart, prioritized by urgency. She wrote the list in the shorthand first, and then made herself slow down and write it clearly, because Nathan was going to take it to the supply steward, who was not going to have her shorthand. "I want to go," she said, when she was done. Nathan looked at her. "To the villages," she said. "Not permanently. For 4 or 5 days. To assess the 2 elderly cases personally, and make sure the treatments I'm sending are being applied correctly." He considered this for a moment. "I'll pass that to the Alpha King," he said carefully. "I'm not asking for permission," she said, and then stopped, because that was not entirely accurate. She was asking for the logistics, which required his awareness, which was close enough to permission, that the distinction was mostly about her own feelings on the matter. "I mean, I'll speak to him myself. I just want you to know that I think it's necessary." "I'll tell him that too," Nathan said, with the neutral tone of a man who had grown up navigating the distance between what people meant and what they said. She went to Calum before dinner. He was in his study, the western one, which she had begun to understand was his working space rather than his meeting space, the room where he did the actual daily management of the kingdom, rather than the room where he received people and made impressions. He had given her access to it without ceremony. which still struck her as significant in ways she was not sure she had fully accounted for. He looked up when she came in. She told him what Nathan had told her. She told him she wanted to go south. He was quiet for exactly long enough that she prepared herself for the kind of careful, reasonable objection that she would not be able to argue with easily. "When?" he said. "As soon as the supply cart can be arranged," she said. "2 days, if that's possible." He nodded. "I'll tell Henry." She stood there for a moment, waiting for the condition, the caveat, the but. It did not come. She had made her exit, and was nearly at the door before she stopped. "Don't you want to know why I think it's necessary for me to go personally?" she said. He looked at her from across the study. "You said 2 elderly people needed direct assessment, and that written instructions weren't sufficient for the complication level. That seems clear." "You could send a physician from the city," she said. "I could," he agreed. "Do you think that would be better?" She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "Then you should go," he said, and went back to his papers. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she needed to. She had been married for 2 months. She had been in this palace for nearly 3. She had arrived expecting to be managed, contained, navigated around, the way she had always been managed in her family, the way women in her position in stories were managed, given the appearance of space while the walls were quietly placed just a little further out. She had been waiting for the walls. They were not appearing. She went to the kitchen and told Helen she was going south for 5 days, and asked if there was anything from the kitchen stores that should go into the supply cart. Helen said yes, and began listing things, without pausing for Lyra to write them down, which she had learned was how Helen communicated. She assumed you were keeping up. Lyra kept up. She left 2 days later on a Wednesday morning, with Nathan and 2 palace guards, and a cart that was loaded with medical supplies, food stores, and 3 jars of Helen's preserved fruit that had appeared at the bottom of the cart, with no explanation and no paperwork. She did not look back at the palace as they rode out, but she was aware of it at her back, the way you're aware of a thing that has begun to matter to you before you've decided to let it. She looked at the road ahead and thought about the 2 elderly people in the southern villages and what she was going to find when she got there, and she did not let herself think about anything else for the next 2 days. But on the second night, sleeping in the common room of a roadside inn, with Nathan and the guards in their own section, and the cold coming through the shutters, and the sound of horses settling in the stable outside, she thought about Calum in his study, saying, "Then you should go," with the simple conviction of a man who trusted the judgment of the person in front of him, without needing to be convinced. She had never had that. Not from her father, not from any official she had worked with. She had spent 4 years in the Eastern Territories building a practice that was hers, and the cost of that had been that everything she had built alone, because asking for trust from people who were inclined to withhold it was its own form of exhausting work. He did not make her ask. She was not ready to think about what that meant. She closed her eyes and listed the treatment priorities she had set for tomorrow's arrival, in order of urgency, and fell asleep on the 4th item. The southern villages were smaller than she had expected, and larger than the problem suggested they should be. This was the thing about supply chain failures. They made a place look smaller than it was, because the energy of a place, its visible activity and its noise and its sense of itself, contracted when the basic maintenance of daily life required more effort than usual. She saw this in the first village, called Westmere by the people in it, as soon as the cart pulled in. The market square was quiet for the time of day. The people who were there moved with the deliberate conservation of people who were managing carefully. But the structures were solid. The fields, though late in the season, showed signs of a community that knew what it was doing. The children who stopped to look at the cart did so with the alert curiosity of children who were fed, even if they were not flourishing. She got to work. She had 5 days, and 2 serious cases, and a general population assessment to complete. She organized it the way she organized everything, by priority, by what would deteriorate fastest if she did not address it first. The woman with the chronic lung condition was in a house at the edge of Westmere, cared for by her daughter, a capable and exhausted woman named Grace, who had been managing without the treatment supplies for 3 months, and who was, Lyra could see immediately, doing so on a combination of competence and sheer force of will that was not going to hold indefinitely. She examined the patient. She assessed the damage from the treatment gap. She went through Grace's home supply of whatever had been available and calculated what could be supplemented and what needed to be replaced entirely. She should have been worse, she told Grace quietly, while the older woman rested on her cot in the back room. Grace's expression was complicated. I've been substituting some things. I learned from watching the village healer who was here until 5 years ago. I've probably done some things wrong. You've done most things right, Lyra said. The honey compresses for the chest. Where did you learn that? Old Mara, the healer. It works. It's not what I'd use, but it works. And the fact that you had the presence of mind to keep it up consistently is why she's not worse. She looked at the treatment record Grace had been keeping in a small notebook. Careful, detailed, the record of a woman who took the responsibility seriously. Can I copy some of this? Grace looked surprised. You want to copy it? This, Lyra said, touching the notebook, is information about what works when the standard treatments aren't available. That's useful. If you're willing. Grace was willing. Lyra spent that first evening copying Grace's notebook by lamplight and thinking about knowledge that lived in places no formal record could reach, in the hands of women who had learned from other women, in the margins of books that no one official had thought to consult. In 4 years of practice in the Eastern Territories, she had learned more from her patients and their families than she had from any published medical text, and she had learned to listen for it deliberately, because the people who had the information rarely presented it as such. The second serious case was in the next village, a 2-hour ride east, a man named Samuel, who was 81 years old, and had been managing a joint condition for 30 years that had recently been complicated by a dietary deficiency she could address with what she had brought. Samuel received her with the mild interest of a man who had seen enough of life that a healer arriving from the palace with a full supply kit was notable but not astonishing. "You're the new wife," he said, looking at her with bright, tired eyes. "Yes," she said. "What's he like?" Samuel said. "The king, up close." She thought about it. "Complicated," she said. "Good complicated or bad complicated?" She thought about it again. "I haven't decided," she said. Samuel nodded, as though this were a satisfactory answer. "My wife was complicated," he said. 43 years. Worth every bit of it. She treated him for 2 hours and left instructions with his son that were specific and organized, and included Grace's honey compress method as a supplementary option if the primary treatment became unavailable. She spent 5 days in the villages. She treated the 4 children with respiratory infections and spent an hour with each family, explaining what to watch for and when it became serious rather than manageable. She assessed the general population with Nathan's help. He was, she confirmed over these 5 days, genuinely capable, and took the medical portion of the assessment with the same seriousness he gave the administrative portion. She identified 2 additional people who needed attention she had not been briefed on before leaving, which she dealt with and added to her report. In the evenings she sat with Grace and, on 2 occasions, with a small group of village women who had heard she was there and come with questions they had been carrying for months. She answered all of them. She asked questions back. She added 4 pages of notes to her remedy book that had nothing to do with the official report, but everything to do with what she was learning about the gap between what healthcare looked like in the palace and what it looked like 50 miles south. On the last evening, Nathan said, "The Alpha King sent a message this afternoon." She looked up from her writing. "He's asking for a status report when we're back. I've prepared the administrative side." He paused. He also asked specifically how the 2 elderly patients are. She looked at Nathan. "Not in the context of the report," Nathan said, with the careful neutrality of a man reporting accurately. "Separately. Just how they are." She went back to her writing. She thought about Samuel and his 43 years of complicated. She thought about Grace's careful notebook. She thought about the message that had come from the palace asking not about the supply routes or the administrative failure or the political implications, but about how 2 specific people were doing. She finished her notes. She packed her kit. They left the next morning in the early cold, with the first real snow of the season beginning to fall in thin, quiet lines from a gray sky. She sat in the cart and watched the village's retreat, and thought about what she was going to say in the report, and what she was going to say that wasn't in the report, just to him. She arrived back at the palace at dusk. She went directly to Calem's study. She told him about Grace, about Samuel, about the 4 children, about the notes she had taken from the village women, and what they told her about the wider gaps. She talked for 30 minutes, and he listened to all of it, and when she was done, he asked about Samuel specifically. Was the joint condition stable? Was the dietary supplement sufficient? Did she think a regular supply route would maintain the improvement? Yes, yes, and yes, she said. If the route holds. It will hold, he said. She looked at him. I've restructured the Southern Supply Coordination through a single department starting next week, he said. Edward will oversee it directly. No more parallel systems. She nodded. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. She had been away for 5 days and she had been busy every hour of it, and she was tired in the specific way of someone who had done good work and run out of energy and needed to eat something and sleep. And all of those things were available to her here, and she was aware of that. Thank you, she said, for letting me go. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression that she could not fully read. You didn't need my permission, he said. I know, she said. I'm thanking you for understanding that. He was quiet for a moment. How was it? He said. Not about the patients, not about the administrative findings, about her. How was it for her? She was so tired that her guard was down enough to answer honestly. Hard, she said, in the way that important work is hard, not in the way that bad things are hard. She paused. Samuel asked what you were like. What did you tell him? Complicated, she said. Something moved in his expression. The very slight, very controlled thing that she had come to understand was his version of a real smile. That's fair, he said. She went to dinner. She ate more than she usually did. She went to her rooms and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about 5 days in the cold South, and the things she had learned there, and the message that had come asking specifically about 2 people by name. She thought about what it meant to be watched over by someone who did not make it feel like surveillance. She was too tired to hold the thought at arm's length tonight. She let it come close. She examined it honestly, the way she examined everything, with the full attention she usually reserved for her patients, for things that mattered and deserved care. She was not yet ready to name what was happening. But she stopped pretending it wasn't happening. That felt, she decided as she finally lay down in the dark, like its own kind of progress. The argument started over a map. It was not supposed to be an argument. She had gone to Calum's study with a specific intention, a reasonable, professional, tightly organized intention, which was to present the findings from the southern villages in the formal framework that the council meeting scheduled for the following week would require, and to discuss what those findings meant for the broader healthcare access problem she had been documenting over the past 3 months. She had notes, she had a clear structure, she was prepared. What she had not prepared for was the wall map. It was the large territorial map that hung in the main corridor. She had noticed it on her first day, and registered it as the map of a man who was thinking seriously about his kingdom. But Calum had a second one in his study, detailed and annotated in his own hand, and it was this one that caught her attention when she came in, because it was covered in markings she had not seen on the corridor version. Specific lines, supply routes, she thought at first, and then she looked more carefully and saw that they were something else, projected routes, future plans, with dates and quantities marked at intervals. She stopped in front of the map. Those are the proposed infrastructure extensions, he said, from behind his desk, without looking up from what he was reading. 5-year plan. The council will see the overview next week. She looked at the routes. She looked at where they reached and, more specifically, where they didn't reach. The southern villages aren't on this, she said. He looked up then. Westmere and the 2 villages east of it, she said, pointing. There's no extension line here. Nothing projected for them. The route restoration I ordered last week. That restores what they had, she said. What they had was insufficient. I spent 5 days there. I have 4 pages of notes that I would like to actually discuss rather than summarize. The medical access problem in those villages is not solved by restoring a broken supply line. It requires a structural change, specifically a regional healer post, or at minimum, a regular trained medical visit, quarterly at least, with. We don't have the capacity. For quarterly visits, or for admitting that the 5-year plan has a gap in it. There was a silence. She had not planned to say it like that. She had planned the presentation carefully, measured, evidence-based, the kind of proposal that started with the problem and worked through the solution methodically. She had not planned the sharp edge that had come into her voice when she looked at the map and saw the gap. Calum was looking at her steadily. "Both," he said. She blinked. "The 5-year plan has a gap in it," he said, "and we don't currently have the capacity for quarterly medical visits to the outer villages. Both things are true." She had been ready to argue. The straightforward agreement knocked the argument sideways. "Then what's the plan to address it?" she said. "That's what I'm trying to work out," he said. "The infrastructure budget is fixed for the first 2 years. Some things can be adjusted in years 3 through 5, but not without displacing something else." He set down the paper he had been holding and stood up and came to stand beside her at the map. "Show me what you saw." She looked at him. "The 4 pages of notes," he said. "Show me what they mean on the map." She looked at the map. She showed him. She started with Westmere and Grace's household and the treatment gap, and what 3 months without the right medicine looked like in a specific body. She moved to Samuel and the dietary deficiency and what a regular visit would have caught earlier. She described the children's respiratory infections in terms of what a quarterly medical check would have allowed. Early identification, early treatment, a different outcome. She put her finger on the map at the point where the nearest trained medical person was currently located and traced the distance to Westmere and said, "This is the gap, this specific distance, in winter, with a sick child." He listened. He asked questions, specific ones. "What's the minimum?" he said. "Not the ideal. What's the actual minimum that would make a measurable difference?" She thought about it honestly. A trained person in Westmere who can do basic assessment and triage. Not a full healer. Someone I could train in 3 months. With a medical kit I can prepare and teach them to maintain. And a direct supply line to me for anything beyond basic treatment. "That's achievable," he said. "Within the budget constraints? The training costs less than the infrastructure line. And the medical kit cost is recoverable in reduced serious case transport costs." He was looking at the map. "We'd need the right person in Westmere. Someone local who already has relevant skills." She thought of Grace immediately. "I may already know who," she said. He looked at her. "A woman named Grace," she said. "She has been providing informal care for her mother for years. She kept records. She substituted treatments correctly when the supply failed. She has the instincts and the discipline. She needs formal training, not starting knowledge." He was quiet for a moment. "Can you go back to Westmere? When I have a training program to take with me," she said. "I'll need 4 weeks to develop it properly." 4 weeks, he said. He nodded. "Do it." She stood at the map for a moment. The argument had moved, in the space of 40 minutes, from confrontation to plan. She was not entirely sure how that had happened. "You agreed with me about the map gap very quickly," she said. "The map gap is real," he said. "Most people defend their plans when someone points out a problem with them." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The plan is a tool," he said. "If it has a flaw, the useful response is to fix it." She thought about her father, who had never once revised a plan based on information provided by someone with less authority. She thought about the clan lords she had dealt with in the East, who had treated challenges to their decisions as personal attacks to be neutralized. "Your council," she said. "How do they take it when you change the plan based on new information?" "Some of them find it unsettling," he said. And there was something in his tone that acknowledged this, as a fact he had learned to work with, rather than a problem he had solved. "They prefer consistency, even wrong consistency." "That's common," she said. "I know. How do you manage it?" He looked at her. "I give them enough consistency that the changes feel like adjustments rather than reversals," he said. "And I explain my reasoning, not to ask permission, to keep the trust." She looked at the map. She thought about that for a moment. "My father never explained his reasoning," she said. "It came out before she planned it. He did not say anything immediately. He just waited. He made decisions and then informed people," she said. "He thought of explanation as weakness, as giving people material to argue with." She stopped. She had not meant to say this much. "Anyway," she said. "It's not weakness," he said. "Explanation isn't permission. They're different things." She looked at him. His face was completely serious, not performing comfort, not filling the space with something warm to make her feel better. Just saying what he believed, clearly. She had needed to hear that for years. She did not say so. The training program, she said. I'll have a first draft for you to look at in 2 weeks. For me, he said, with a slight shift in expression that she now recognized as interest. You'll be explaining it to the council, she said. You should understand what's in it. I meant, you want my input on the medical content? No, she said. I want you to understand the reasoning, so that when someone asks you a question about it, you can answer from the actual logic, rather than the summary. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. She left the study. She walked to her practice room, sat at her long table, and pulled out a fresh page. She had come in with a prepared presentation and left with a working plan. The argument had not been an argument in the end, or it had been the kind of argument that was really just two people examining the same problem from different angles until the angles aligned. She had not experienced that before. Disagreement in her family had been about winning and losing. Disagreement with the officials she had worked with had been about authority. This had been about the problem. She started writing the training program. She worked for 2 hours before she stopped and thought, this is what it feels like to work with someone. Not for someone, not against someone, with. She had been working alone for so long that she had forgotten the specific quality of it, the way a shared purpose created a different kind of energy than solitary work. More friction, but also more momentum. The friction of two minds on the same thing was different from the friction of obstruction. It was alive. She went back to her writing. The training program took 3 weeks rather than 4. She had underestimated how much she already knew, and how quickly the structure came once she started. She developed it in sections: basic assessment, the 10 symptoms that always required immediate escalation, wound care, fever management, the specific conditions most common in that climate and altitude. She included references, and she wrote detailed explanations of why each treatment worked, not just what it was, because Grace was the kind of learner who needed the reason, not just the instruction. She showed the first draft to Caleb on a Thursday evening. He read all of it. He asked 3 questions, 2 about the escalation criteria, and 1 about the supply kit maintenance schedule. They were good questions, the kind that improved the thing. This is clear, he said, setting it down. It should be, she said. She's never had formal training. Everything has to be explicit. Not just her, he said. You wrote it so that anyone could use it. She blinked. That's the point. If Grace trains someone after her, they'll need this too. He looked at the document, and then at her. You're building a system, he said. I'm treating a patient, she said. The patient is the village. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the tone of someone who had thought about something and decided to say it, I would like you to present this to the council next week, instead of the summary I was planning to give. She stared at him. They should hear it from you, he said. They should understand what it is, and what it means, and who built it. If I present it, it becomes one item on a list. If you present it, it becomes, he paused, something they remember. She was aware that this was significant. The council was the formal governing body. Her presence there was technically permitted, but had not been. She was his wife, not an official, and the line between the two had been maintained, with the careful courtesy of people who were uncertain what the new arrangement meant. You're making space, she said. I'm telling the council that the healer's practice is a governing matter, he said, which it is, and that the person running it is someone they should be consulting, which they should. She looked at him. This is not an arrangement I asked for, she said. She meant the council presentation, but she was aware it sounded like she meant the larger thing. I know, he said. I can do it, she said. I know that too, he said. She gathered the pages of the training program and straightened them. I'll need to know who on the council is going to be a problem, she said. 2 of them, he said, and told her which ones and why, with the specific and useful detail of someone who knew these people well and understood that preparation mattered more than optimism. She wrote the names down. She left the study feeling something she had not felt since she had arrived in the Northern Crown, the specific energy of a challenge she was actually prepared for, facing a room that might be difficult, in a position that was hers. She was not happy about how she had come to be here. She was never going to be happy about that, but she was here, And here was starting to have edges and weight and meaning, and she was the one giving it those things, and no one was trying to take them from her. That was something. It was. She was slowly allowing herself to understand, more than she had expected to find. The council meeting was on a Monday. She spent the weekend preparing in the way she prepared for anything difficult, by knowing the material so well that she could not be surprised by it. She read her own training program until she could answer questions about any section from any angle. She thought about the 2 council members Calum had identified, and she thought about what they were likely to challenge, and what those challenges would really be about underneath the surface objection. One of them, a man named Lord Aldrich, would challenge the cost. This was a man who managed the kingdom's accounts with an efficiency she had come to respect from a distance, and who saw everything through the lens of whether it could be sustained long term. He was not wrong to think this way. She would need to meet him on his own ground. The other, a woman named Lady Claire, would challenge the precedent. Claire was the longest-serving council member, a woman who had been in her position since Calum's father's time, and who had navigated the transition between reigns, with the careful balance of someone who understood that institutions outlasted individuals, and that change, even correct change, had consequences for the systems that held things together. She was not an obstacle so much as a guardrail. Lyra had come to understand the difference. She prepared for both. When Monday came, she was ready. The council room was smaller than she had imagined, a round room, which meant no one was visibly at the head or the foot of the table, a choice that felt deliberate. There were 8 council members plus Calum. She was the 9th person in the room, and she was aware that this was notable, and she did not perform awareness of it. She presented. She started with the problem, specific, concrete, human. Grace and her mother. Samuel and his joint condition, the 4 children and their lungs. She did not speak in abstractions, because the problem was not abstract, and she had learned a long time ago that the easiest way to lose a room was to let the people in it forget that you were talking about actual people. She moved to the solution, the training program, the cost breakdown, the supply kit, the escalation system. She was organized. She answered the questions that arose as she went, not deflecting them but pulling them in, and addressing them fully, because the questions were mostly good ones, and the good questions improved the presentation. Lord Aldrich asked about the cost. She showed him the numbers she had prepared, the training program against the current cost of emergency transport from the villages for serious cases that had not been caught early. She had been conservative in her estimates. The numbers were clear. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered both. Lady Claire asked about the precedent. What did it mean for other villages? Was she prepared to design similar programs for the other 17 outer settlements in the Northern Crown? Lyra had thought about this. Yes, she said. Not all at once. The southern villages are the most urgent, but the model I'm developing here is designed to be replicable. Each village would need an assessment first, and the program adjusted for local conditions, but the framework transfers. Claire considered this. That's a significant commitment of your time, she said. Yes, Lyra said, it is. There was a pause. Claire looked at Calum, briefly, with the look of a woman who had known him for a long time, and was checking something she already suspected she knew the answer to. Then she looked back at Lyra. The training program, she said. Is it written so that someone other than you could deliver it, eventually? Yes, Lyra said. That's the point of it. Claire nodded once, the specific nod of someone who has received a satisfactory answer and is done with that line of questioning. The council voted, 6 in favor, 2 abstentions. Lord Aldrich and Lady Claire both abstained, which, as Margaret explained to her afterward over dinner, was the council's way of saying, we're watching this but we're not opposed, which was considered a positive outcome for a first proposal. Calum said nothing during the meeting. He had told her he was going to do that. Stay out of it, and let her make the case herself. He had meant it as a practical matter, not a statement about her capability, and she had taken it as such. But sitting in the council room afterward, while the other members filed out and he remained behind, she understood something she had not fully understood before. He had set this up so that the council's relationship with her would be direct, not mediated through him, not dependent on him, her. Thank you, she said, when they were the only 2 left. You did it, he said. You arranged for me to be able to do it, she said. He met her eyes for a moment. There's a difference between arranging an opportunity and taking it, he said. You took it. She looked at him. She was going to say something, some response that kept the appropriate distance, that maintained the careful architecture of their arrangement. She had been maintaining it for 4 months. She was very good at it. She said, "Instead, I'm going to go back to Westmere next month. Will you come?" She had not planned to say it. It came out of somewhere she hadn't been monitoring. He looked at her. "To see what you've been working on," she said, and was aware of how plainly she meant more than that. To see Grace. To see what the villages look like when they have what they need. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She picked up her papers. She left. She walked to her practice room and sat down and looked at the wall. She had just invited her husband to come with her somewhere she valued. That was new. She was not certain when she had started wanting him to see the things she was proud of. Somewhere between the map argument and the training program and the council meeting, something had shifted in the architecture of what she felt, and she had only just noticed it. She was not ready to look at it directly, but she also, she realized, was not going to pretend it wasn't there. She opened her remedy book. She started writing the first assessment framework for the second village on the list. She worked until the light from the eastern window went dark, and Helen sent someone to remind her that dinner had been ready for half an hour. She closed the book, straightened her notes, and went to the long table where Calum was already seated, reading his evening report, and where her plate was in its usual place, and the fire was going, and the room was warm, and full of the ordinary, unremarkable sounds of the household she had been slowly, quietly, without quite deciding to, beginning to think of as hers. Winter arrived in the Northern Crown the way it always did, which the household had warned her about, and which she had not fully believed until it happened. It did not creep in. It announced itself over the course of 48 hours in early November, first with a wind that came down from the northern mountains with a specific and serious authority, then with a temperature drop that made the stones of the palace feel different underfoot, and then with snow. Not the thin, exploratory snow she had seen arriving from the south. Real snow, the kind that committed. She watched it from the eastern window of her practice room on the first morning of it, with her tea getting cold on the table, and thought about the villages, about the road to Westmere and whether it would stay passable, about Grace and whether she had the winter supplies she needed, about Samuel, 81 years old, whose joint condition worsened in the cold. She had already sent everything she could send in the supply cart the previous week, anticipating this. She had already written Grace 4 letters over the past month, 2 about the treatment details, 1 about a specific symptom to watch for in the older patients, and 1 that had started as professional and ended up being something more like a conversation between 2 people who were working on the same problem from different angles. Grace had written back to all 4. Her letters were practical and clear, and contained, at the edges, a dry humor that Lyra had not expected and found herself looking forward to. She drank the cold tea and told herself she had done what she could for Westmere from here, and that winter was not a medical failure. It was a condition that you prepared for. Then she went downstairs and began the day. Her patient load had grown. This surprised her, even though it should not have. She had been in the palace for 4 months. She had become, in that time, a known quantity, not just to the staff and the immediate household, but to the broader circle of people who moved through the Northern Crown regularly, merchants who dealt with the palace, clan representatives who visited for meetings, tradespeople and craftsmen who worked on the grounds. They found their way to her practice room with ailments that ranged from the immediate to the long neglected, and she treated them with the same systematic care she gave everyone. She did not make distinctions about who came in or why. She had her notes from the Eastern Territories, and her notes from the last 4 months, and her remedy book with its margins thick with additions, and she worked from all of it. She realized on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, busy in a way she had not been since the Eastern Territories. Not just treating people, building something. The supply record system had been running smoothly for 2 months now, and Edward had become its most devoted keeper. The training program for Westmere was in its final version, and scheduled for the return visit she and Calum had planned for, after the first hard frost. She had submitted a preliminary framework to the council for a 3rd village on the outer ring, and Lady Clare had sent her a note with 2 useful observations that had improved it. She was doing real work. Here, in this place she had not chosen. The realization sat in her chest with a complicated weight. She had spent 4 years building a practice in the Eastern Territories because she had needed to build something that was hers, away from her family and their management of her. She had done it slowly and with effort, and she had been proud of it. But she was building something larger here, with access she had not had there, with the specific backing of an institution that could actually make the change stick. The Westmere training program would not evaporate when the next supply chain failed. It would not depend on her being physically present. It was a system, and systems outlasted the people who built them. She had not expected to find that here. She did not tell Calum this. She held it privately, the way she held most things that mattered, and examined it in the evenings, in the quiet of her practice room, while she wrote her notes, and the snow came down outside, and the palace settled into its winter rhythms. Their evenings had changed. She had not planned this. She had not planned most of the things that had changed between them, which was perhaps the point. Planned change was controlled, and controlled things stayed contained. The changes that happened without planning had their own momentum. He came to the library most evenings now, as he apparently always had, and she had begun going there too, because the library had the best reading light in the palace, and because she had worked through the small collection of medical texts in her practice room, and the library had more. The first several times they had been in the same room without really acknowledging it, two people sharing a space without interaction. Then he had asked, one evening, what she was reading, and she had told him, and the answer had led to a conversation about a specific treatment approach she had been thinking about, and the conversation had lasted an hour. After that it became a thing they did. She brought her work, he brought his. They sat in the library 2 or 3 evenings a week, in the separate but comfortable silence of people who were sharing the same room in their own ways, and occasionally one of them would say something, and it would turn into a conversation that lasted until the fire needed tending, and one of them noticed, and they both looked at the time, and found it was later than they had thought. She was aware of what was happening. She was not performing unawareness to herself, the way she had earlier in the autumn. She allowed herself to see it clearly. She liked him. Not in the way of a dramatic arrival at a feeling, not in the way stories described it, where something sudden changed the landscape. She liked him in the way that a slowly changing season arrives, not with a single moment, but with an accumulation of evidence. The way he said exactly what he meant. The way he prepared for difficulty, rather than reacting to it. The way he asked about people specifically. About Samuel, about Grace, about Will's hand, about Sella's rash. Not as courtesy, but because he actually wanted to know. She liked the way he sat in the library. Slightly too still, the way of a person whose default state required them to manage energy carefully. She liked the way he went back to look at maps on the wall when he was thinking, not because the map contained the answer, but because looking at something specific helped him think. She noticed these things and she allowed herself to notice them, and she did not do anything about any of them, because noticing was not the same as acting, and she was not ready to act. One evening in late November, Calum put down the report he was reading and said, without looking up, "My father made an arrangement for me when I was 24. She looked up from her book. He was looking at the fire, not at her. "A political match," he said. "A woman from the Western clans. It was a reasonable arrangement, strategically. I had met her twice." He paused. There was a border incident, 8 months after the arrangement was finalized. She was traveling with a delegation. The route was supposed to be secured. He did not say more than that. She understood what he had not said. She was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" she said. 6 years. She absorbed this. "The library," she said carefully. "The evening you said it was an anniversary." "November," he said. "It was November." She looked at him. He was still looking at the fire, and his face had the quality she had seen that first time in the library. The thing underneath the composure, briefly visible, and then covered again. She did not say she was sorry. She did not offer comfort in the way of someone who felt the need to fill the space. She sat with it, the way she sat with patients who were telling her something difficult, because this was a person telling her something real, and the right response was to receive it fully, rather than deflect it. "The arrangement was your father's," she said. "Yes," he said. "But she died while it was active." "Yes." She looked back at her book. She did not look at it. She thought about what he had just told her, and what it meant about the 6 years between then and the night she arrived in this palace, and what it meant about the man who had received her with those precise and practical terms, and who had, she understood now, carried this weight through every decision he had made in the years since. "You should have told me earlier," she said. He looked at her then. "Not because I needed to know," she said. "Because you've been carrying it alone. That's more expensive than it should be." He was quiet for a long time. "You're very direct," he said. "Yes," she said. "Do you mind?" "No," he said. "I don't mind." She went back to her book. He went back to his fire. The library was quiet around them. But the silence after that was different from the silence before, more complete. The kind of quiet that happens after something necessary has been said, and the saying has settled and become part of the room's furniture. She read for another hour. When she finally closed her book and stood, he was still there, looking at the fire. She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night," and looked up at her with eyes that were, for once, not composed. She walked back to her rooms in the cold, long corridor, and did not let herself think until she reached the door of her sitting room, and then she stopped, with her hand on the door, and stood there for a moment. He had told her something real tonight, something he had been keeping inside a locked room for 6 years, or at least he had told her the shape of it, which was not the same as telling her everything, but was more than he had told anyone in a long time, she thought. She went inside. She sat at her writing table and did not write anything. She sat with the evening, and what had been said in it, and what it was changing. She had arrived in this place with her anger organized, and her plans clear, and her heart carefully managed. She had done very well at the management for 4 months. She was not certain she was going to be able to keep doing it. Not because the anger had gone away. It hadn't, not entirely. The fundamental wrong of being traded between families like a strategic asset had not been undone, and would not be. But the anger had begun to be accompanied by something else. Something that lived beside it, rather than underneath it. And the something else was taking up more room than she had intended to give it. She thought about a man who sat in a library on November evenings, who had lost someone 6 years ago, and built a kingdom in the years since, and had apparently not told anyone about the cost of it until tonight, in a library, to a woman he had received with practical terms, and an empty room, and a supply list. She thought, he trusted me with that. And then, I trust him. She did not know, exactly, when that had happened. Somewhere between the map argument in the council meeting, and the evenings in the library, trust had been built between them, the way trust was always actually built. Not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. The small transactions of daily honesty, the things said and meant, the things done without requiring acknowledgement. She sat at her writing table until she was very tired. Then she went to bed, and looked at the ceiling of her room in the Northern Crown, and felt the particular unsteadiness of a person who has arrived somewhere new, without realizing they have moved. She was not the same as she had been when she arrived. She was not sure yet what she was instead. But she was going to find out, she decided, and the decision felt less like resolution than like permission. Permission to find out. That was enough for tonight. December came in over the mountains, like a new chapter. The days were short, and the nights were long, and the palace contracted into itself in the way of a large household during a serious winter. Warmth concentrated in the kitchens and the library, and the main dining room, and the corridors between them. The outer wings were kept at a minimum temperature, and used only for storage and occasional necessity. The household spent more of its time in shared spaces, which created a specific quality of communal warmth that Lyra had not expected, and had not had for years. She found she did not mind it. She found, actually, that she had been lonelier in the Eastern Territories than she had let herself know. She had built her practice, and her independence, and her deliberate isolation from her family's world, and those had been necessary and correct. But she had also been alone, in a way that she had managed by staying busy, which was not the same as resolving it. Here, there were people she knew. There was Helen who fed her, and Margaret who argued with her, and Edward who had become a genuine collaborator, and Will from the stables who stopped by her practice room weekly, on the thinnest of pretexts. There was Nathan, back from his southern assessments and writing reports she had begun to review as a matter of course. There was Sella, who visited the practice room on Tuesday afternoons, ostensibly to report on the wool blanket situation, but really because she had decided to be interested in medicine in the way that small children are interested in things they have decided matter. Selah asked the kind of questions that had no bad answer if you approached them correctly. Why did cuts have to be covered? What was fever, and where did it come from? How did a person know if something was serious, or if it would get better on its own? Lyra answered all of them. She had learned, with Selah, to answer fully and without condescension, because Selah received condescension with the polite blankness of a child who has learned that adults sometimes failed to treat her seriously, and who had decided that this said more about them than about her. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December, Selah was sitting on the corner of the table in the practice room, while Lyra wrote up a treatment record, and Selah said, without looking up from the dried plant specimen she had been examining with intense focus, "Do you like it here?" Lyra set down her pen. "I didn't used to," she said honestly. "I'm not sure what I think now." Selah considered this. "That's better than no," she said. "Is it?" "No means you've decided," Selah said. "Not sure means you're still looking." She set the specimen down. "My father used to say that." Lyra looked at her. Selah's expression was the particular composure of a child, discussing something that had been processed enough to be spoken about directly, but not so long ago that it was completely without cost. "He was wise," Lyra said. "He was," Selah agreed. She picked up the specimen again. "Is this a mint plant?" "Spearmint," Lyra said. "The leaves are slightly narrower than regular mint. Can you eat it?" "Yes. It's also useful for upset stomachs when made into a tea." Selah filed this information with the same gravity she gave everything, which was considerable. When she left, Lyra sat at her table and thought about what the child had said. Not sure means you're still looking. She had been told variations on that truth over the years by people with far more elaborate language to dress it in, and none of them had made it as clear as a 5-year-old with a spearmint leaf. She was still looking. That was accurate. And what she was finding, when she looked, was something she had not packed in the trunk she had brought north. Something she was building here, from the specific materials of this place, and this household, and these people, and this man, who sat in the library on November evenings, and told her things he had not told anyone else. She was building a life. Not the one she had started to build in the East, a different one, larger and more complicated, and set inside an institution she had arrived angry at, and had begun, incrementally and without quite deciding to feel responsible for. Calum found her that evening in the library, earlier than usual, and he was carrying 2 cups of tea, which he set down on the table between them, without ceremony, one in front of her chair, and one at his. She looked at the cup. "Helen says you forget to drink it when it's hot," he said. She looked at him. "I asked her this morning," he said, "if there was anything the practice room needed." She picked up the cup. The tea was the dark, strong kind Helen knew she liked. It was hot. "You were thinking about the practice room this morning?" "I was thinking about you," he said, plainly, in the tone he used when he was stating a fact and not dressing it up. She held the cup. The library was quiet around them. The fire was going. The snow was coming down outside the long windows in the steady, committed way of northern winter snow. She had arrived here with her anger organized, and her distance maintained, and her plans clear. She had done very well at all 3. But she was sitting in a library in December, with a cup of hot tea that someone had thought about this morning, and the distance was not doing what distances were supposed to do, which was to keep things separate. "Calum," she said. He looked up from where he had opened his report. "Thank you," she said, "for this." She lifted the cup slightly. "And for all of it. The practice space, the council meeting, the supply routes, for treating every problem I brought you like it was worth solving." He was quiet for a moment. "You brought problems worth solving," he said. "You didn't have to listen to me," she said. "You could have done this differently, given me rooms and kept me separate from everything real." "That would have been pointless," he said. "A lot of men in your position would have done it anyway," she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "I'm not interested in being those men," he said. She held the cup and thought about that. "I know," she said. They sat in the library for 2 more hours. She read. He worked on his report, and intermittently consulted the wall map in the way that meant he was thinking. At some point, she looked up and found him watching her read, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away quickly. She looked back at her book, he looked back at his map. But the room was different after that. The way a room is different when two people have admitted, without words, that they are aware of each other. She did not try to name what was between them. She was going to let it take whatever shape it took, on whatever schedule it set for itself. She was a practical person. She knew that forcing the shape of something while it was still forming only broke it. She went to her rooms that night and slept well for the first time in a week. In the morning, she wrote Grace a letter. She told her about the amended training program and the January visit she was planning and the supply adjustments she had ordered. She told her about the council's approval of the Westmere framework. She told her, at the end, that she was coming with someone who had never seen the southern villages and who she thought should see them, and that she hoped Grace would be willing to show him what she had been doing. She did not explain who she was bringing. She thought Grace would figure it out. She sealed the letter and gave it to Henry with the Morning Post and went to her practice room and started her day. The day began with Will, who had invented a new thin reason to stop by, and whose actual reason, she had come to understand, was that the practice room was a place he was allowed to sit for a few minutes in the middle of a long workday and be treated like a person of consequence. She gave him a few minutes and a task, refilling one of the supply jars, and sent him off with the straightened posture of someone who had been respected. She liked this. She liked the ordinary, repetitive good of it. She liked that it mattered. She had spent 4 years in the Eastern Territories building a practice she was proud of. She was building something larger here. And she admitted to herself in the winter light of the northern morning, no longer angry about being here. She was not ready to say more than that. Saying more than that felt like moving faster than the thing could hold. But the anger had gone, and in its place was something that she did not have a good word for yet, something that was made of mornings in Helen's kitchen, and evenings in the library, and a child with a spearmint leaf asking questions, and a man who had brought her hot tea because he had been thinking about her. Something that, if she were being honest, felt very much like the beginning of something she had not planned, and did not regret. The fever arrived on a Wednesday night, without warning. Lyra was in her practice room, working late on the supply adjustments for the January village visit, when she heard Helen's voice in the corridor outside. Not Helen's usual kitchen authority voice, but a different register, the one that people use when they are being calm on purpose, because not being calm is not an option. She was out of her chair before the knock. Helen was in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her, and her expression composed in the way of a woman who had seen bad things before, and was managing this one efficiently. "Selah," Helen said. Lyra picked up her satchel. Selah's rooms were in the north wing, the inner area she had passed through many times without going into. She followed Helen at a pace that was not quite running, because running triggered panic in everyone around you, and panic was not what was needed. The girl's mother, whose name, Lyra had finally learned, was Anne, was standing in the doorway of Selah's room, with both hands pressed flat against the doorframe, and her face doing the thing that parents' faces did when the thing happening to their child was beyond the scale of ordinary worry. "How long?" Lyra said. "She was fine at dinner," Anne said. "She ate. She was talking. I put her to bed at 8, and when I checked at 10 she was burning." Lyra went in. Selah was in the center of her large bed, propped up on 2 pillows, and her face was flushed in the way of a fever that had come on fast. Her eyes were open and fixed on Lyra with the focus of someone who was very sick and was choosing, out of all available options, to look at the person who might be able to help. "Hello," Lyra said. "Hello," Selah said. Her voice was thin and dry. Lyra sat on the edge of the bed and began her assessment. Temperature, pulse, breathing. She checked Selah's throat, her neck, the response of her eyes. She asked questions in a voice kept deliberately level. How long had her throat been sore? Had she had a headache during the day? Had anyone else in the household been ill? The fever was high. That was the immediate fact. High enough to require active management rather than watchful waiting. She went to work. She sent Anne for cold, clean water. She sent Helen, who had remained in the doorway with the contained readiness of a person waiting to be useful, for the specific medicines from the locked cabinet in the practice room, which she named precisely, and in order of need. She stripped the extra blankets from the bed and replaced them with a single light sheet, because Selah needed air circulation more than warmth. Selah watched all of this with those focused eyes. "Are you scared?" Selah asked. while Lyra was preparing the first medicine. Lyra looked at her. No, she said. Truthfully, fear was not useful here, and she had trained it into something operational a long time ago. I'm paying attention. Those aren't the same thing. Sela thought about this. What am I supposed to do? Rest, Lyra said. Let me handle the rest. Is that it? That's the most important thing, Lyra said. Your body is working very hard right now. Resting helps it work. Sela accepted this with her characteristic gravity and closed her eyes. Helen returned with the medicines. Anne returned with the water. Lyra administered the first dose and set up the cooling cloth rotation and checked the temperature again at the half-hour mark. She was settled in the chair beside Sela's bed, writing notes in the lamplight, when she heard the door. Calum came in quietly. He did not speak. He stood just inside the door and looked at Sela and then at Lyra, and his face was doing the thing she had seen it do once before, the thing beneath the composure, the thing he did not usually let out. She met his eyes. Her temperature is high, but not at the most dangerous level, she said quietly. She's responsive. Her breathing is clear. I've started the fever treatment, and I'll check her again at the 2-hour mark. He came further into the room. He did not go to the bed immediately. He stood at the foot of it, looking at the small person who was asleep now, or close to it, with the light sheet pulled up to her chin, and the color still too high in her face. She was talking to me at dinner, he said. His voice was very quiet. I know, Lyra said. That's how these fevers work sometimes. They come fast. He sat down in the chair by the window, not across from her, at a slight angle, so he was facing Sela and not the room. He sat very still. Lyra went back to her notes. They were in that room together for 3 hours. She checked Sela at the 2-hour mark. The temperature had come down half a degree, which was what she wanted to see. She administered the second dose of medicine and changed the cooling cloth and recorded the numbers. She did all of this efficiently and quietly, while Sela half slept and Anne dozed in the chair outside the door, and Calum sat by the window and did not sleep and did not speak and did not move. At the 3-hour mark she checked again. The temperature had dropped enough that she could move from active management to monitoring, checking every hour rather than continuous attention. She told Calum this. He looked up. She's stabilizing, Lyra said. The medicine is working. She's going to be uncomfortable for another day or two, but the immediate danger is past. He was quiet for a long moment. You're certain? He said. Yes, she said. She meant it. She would not have said it if she hadn't. He let out a breath. She watched him do it, watched the specific release of it, the physical reality of a person who has been holding their body in a particular state of managed stillness, and then been given permission to release it. Go to bed, she said. I'll be here until morning. Anne is outside. If anything changes, I'll come to you immediately. He looked at Sela for a moment. He looked at Lyra. And then he said something she had not expected. I'm afraid of losing people, he said. Not explaining, not apologizing. Just saying it, plainly, in the way he said plain things. I've lost enough that He stopped. It doesn't get easier. I thought it would. She held that. No, she said. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at managing the fear while you work. He looked at her for a long moment. You do it well, he said. I had a good teacher, she said. Myself, mostly. Repetition. She paused, and watching other people who did it well, and understanding why. He stood up. He crossed to the bed and looked at Sela for a moment. Just looked, without touching, the way you look at something you need to fully take in. Then he looked at Lyra. Thank you, he said, and he meant it, with the full weight of a person who does not use words carelessly. Go to bed, she said again. I have her. He left. She sat in the chair beside Sela and listened to the palace settle around her into its deep night quiet, and thought about what he had just said. I'm afraid of losing people. The matter-of-fact courage of admitting that. The trust of saying it out loud. She had a patient to watch. She watched her. But underneath the watching and the monitoring and the careful professional attention, something had happened in this room tonight that was separate from the medical situation, and she knew it, and she was not going to look away from it. He had been afraid. He had sat with that fear for 3 hours, quietly, without making it anyone else's problem. And then he had told her about it, because she was here, and it was true, and he trusted her with true things. She had seen people afraid for their loved ones 1,000 times. She had seen it in the Eastern Territories and in this palace, and in every place she had ever worked. It was one of the most ordinary human experiences there was. But there was something about watching this man, who was so self-contained, who managed so much, who carried things with such deliberate and organized care, sitting by the window in the lamplight and being afraid, that had done something to the last of the careful distance she had maintained. She did not name what it had done. Not tonight. Tonight was for Sela. But she sat with the feeling of it, the way you sit with something true and new, and let it be what it was. Sela's temperature was down by 2 degrees by the time the dawn light came through the high window. Lyra wrote the final entry in her notes for the night. She stretched her back, which had been in the same position in that chair for too long. She checked Sela one more time, breathing steady, skin still warm but not dangerously so, eyelids flickering with the lighter sleep of someone moving toward recovery. Anne came in at dawn, carrying tea without being asked, which meant Helen had been keeping watch from the kitchen, and had sent provisions when she judged the moment right. "She's better," Lyra said quietly. Anne's face did the thing that faces do when they have been braced for a long time, and are finally allowed to unclench. Lyra drank the tea. She handed over the monitoring schedule. What to check, when to check it, what signs would mean she needed to be called back immediately. Anne listened with the careful attention of a woman who had been managing alone for long enough that she was very good at receiving and applying instructions. Then Lyra went to find Calum. She found him, as she had somehow suspected she would, not in his rooms but in the corridor outside them, standing at the window that looked north toward the mountains. He had not changed out of the clothes from the previous evening. He heard her coming and turned. She said, before he could ask, "She's better. Temperature is down. She slept the last 2 hours without waking. Anne has the monitoring instructions. You can go see her after breakfast." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Thank you," he said, still with that full weight. "You should sleep," she said. "I know." He did not move. She stood beside him at the window. The northern mountains were just visible in the gray early light, their slopes white with the December snow, massive and still, and old in a way that made the human concerns at the base of them feel both very small and very important. "She asked me last week," she said, "whether she could come to my practice room to learn. She wants to learn about medicine." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. "She's 5, he said. "She's very serious for 5, Lyra said. "And the interest is real. I'd supervise everything, obviously, but I think it would be good for her." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "if she still wants to, when she's well." She nodded. They stood at the window together, in the gray morning light, and the silence that was between them now was not the neutral silence of two people sharing a space, and they both knew it. She was aware of him beside her, aware in the way that she had been trying not to be aware for 2 months, and had been anyway, which was the thing about managed feelings. Managing them was not the same as not having them. "Calum," she said. He looked at her. "I know this wasn't what either of us chose," she said. "The arrangement, the whole thing. I know you didn't have more say in it than I did, in the ways that actually mattered." He was very still. "But I want you to know," she said, "that I'm not," she paused, picking the word carefully, "unhappy, anymore. About being here." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did that change?" he said. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "It happened the way real things happen, without a specific moment." He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something had landed fully. She was going to say more. She wasn't sure what. Something about the evenings in the library, or about the hot tea, or about the 3 hours in Sela's room. Something that moved from where they were to somewhere slightly more honest. But he spoke first. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I know how you arrived. I know the cost of it. But I'm glad." She stood with that for a moment. "So am I," she said. And there it was, simple, true, said in a corridor at dawn after a long night, which was not where she had imagined this moment, but was, she thought, exactly the right place for it. They stood at the window for a few more minutes, watching the morning come over the mountains. Then she said she was going to sleep for a few hours before her morning patients, and he said he would do the same, and they went in their separate directions down the corridor, which was still the ordinary reality of their separate lives inside this shared one. But the corridor was different than it had been. Everything, she thought, was slightly different than it had been. And that was not frightening. That was simply what happened when something began. Sela recovered in 4 days. She was a good patient in the way of serious children, cooperative with the medical instructions, honest about her symptoms, and disinclined toward the dramatic that some children used as a way of processing illness. She stayed in bed when Lyra told her to stay in bed, and drank the medicine without complaint, and by the second day was asking, in a thin but determined voice, whether she was allowed to read yet. Yes, Lyra said. Nothing exciting. Sela had given this a look that communicated her opinion of that restriction clearly, without having to say it. By the 4th day she was up and asking about the practice room. By the 5th she was back to normal, which meant she appeared in the practice room on Tuesday afternoon and sat on the corner of the table and asked about fevers, what they were, where they came from, why the body made them. Lyra answered all of it. She found herself looking forward to Tuesday afternoons in a way she had not expected. Sela asked the kind of questions that required you to think about what you actually knew and why you knew it, because children at that age had not yet learned to accept "that's just how it works" as an answer, and were absolutely right not to. Calum came by the practice room on the Thursday after Sela's recovery. He did not have a stated purpose, which was itself notable. He came in and looked at the shelves, which were very organized, as they always were, and asked how the supply inventory was going, which was a question that had an answer, but not one that required a visit to ask. She answered it anyway. He was looking at the wall where she had pinned the village map extension, her working document for the Westmere program and the adjacent settlements. He looked at it for a moment. The January visit, he said. The roads are good for the first 2 weeks of the month, before the second snowfall pattern comes in. I know, she said. I was planning for the 8th. I can arrange to be free from the 6th to the 14th, he said. She looked at him. If that timing still works, he said. It works, she said. He nodded and left. She sat at her table and thought about a man rearranging his schedule to spend 8 days in the southern villages in January. He was the Alpha King. His schedule was not easily rearranged. There were people who waited weeks to have a meeting with him. He was coming to Westmere because she had asked. She picked up her pen and went back to the supply list she had been working on, but her attention was not fully on it for the rest of the afternoon, which was not her usual mode of operation, and which she noticed and took as information, rather than trying to correct it. The days before Christmas, which the Northern Crown observed in its own regional version with a set of traditions that were older than the current dynasty, were full in the way that the winter season always made things full. More people in the shared spaces, more preparation, more of the particular warmth that gathered when a household anticipated something together. She had not celebrated Christmas with a household since she was 18, when she had still been in her family's estate. She had spent the last 4 Christmases in the Eastern Territories in various configurations of small, alone in her room above the apothecary, or with Clara and one of the other market traders in a gathering that was pleasant but slight. This was not slight. The palace decorated in the northern style, dark green branches from the pine forests, red berries, woven arrangements on the doors and windows, candles in every window facing outward. Helen cooked for 3 days in preparation for the Christmas feast, which was a genuine production that the whole household attended, and that began at noon, and lasted, Lyra was told, until well into the evening. She helped with the preparations, partly because she was curious, and partly because Helen's kitchen was one of the few places in the palace where you could actually be useful without any formal expertise, and partly, if she was honest, because she was enjoying it. The simple, tactile enjoyment of being part of something that other people were also part of. Calum was present for most of the preparations, in a way she had not seen him present before, not managing the household, just in it. He carried things, when things needed carrying. He got in Helen's way twice, and was moved aside both times, with the specific authority of a woman who had known him for 19 years, and had no qualms about telling the Alpha King to stand somewhere else. On the day before Christmas, Lyra found him in the library in the early afternoon, the time he usually reserved for the most concentrated work of the day. He was not working. He was reading a book that was not a report or a policy document or a territorial map, and he had a cup of tea that was actually hot for once. She sat down. "You're reading for pleasure," she said. He looked over the top of the book. "Is that surprising?" "A little," she said. "I've only ever seen you read things you needed." "I need this too," he said, and went back to it. She looked at the spine. It was a history, old, from the binding, of the Northern Territories before the current clan structure. She had not read it herself. She reached out for it without thinking, and he tilted it slightly so she could read the title properly, and their hands were suddenly close, in a way that was entirely accidental, and that she was aware of with the specific and inconvenient clarity of a person who was trying very hard to be ordinary in a moment that had just declined to be. She drew her hand back. She opened her own book. They read for an hour without speaking. Then he said, without looking up, "My great-grandmother used to read that one. The history. She told me. It explained why the North was different from the South, in ways that geography alone couldn't account for." "What did she mean?" Lyra asked. "She meant that the people here had survived things that changed how they built communities. Not just physically, in terms of what they valued. How they thought about the relationship between individual people and the group." He paused. She thought it explained why the clan system here was less hierarchical in practice than it looked on paper. Why people here pushed back. "Did she push back?" Lyra asked. Something moved in his expression. "Constantly," he said. "She was the only person in my grandfather's life who argued with him and won. He built the library for her because she kept buying books and running out of space for them, and the only way to get her to stop buying books was to give her more room. He said later, it was the best decision he ever made." He looked at the fire. "She died before I was born. I only know her from what he told me, and from her notes in the books she left." Lyra looked at the volume in his hands. "She annotated them?" she said. "All of them," he said. "The margins are full." He turned the book so she could see. Dense, neat handwriting in brown ink, covering every available white space in the margins. She argued with the authors. She agreed with them. She recorded what she'd seen that confirmed or contradicted the text. Lyra looked at the margins. She felt something she could not quite name. A warmth, or a recognition. A woman she had never met, dead before she was born, who had filled the margins of a book with everything she knew, who had pushed back and argued, and been built a library. "I do that too," she said. "Fill the margins." He looked at her. "My remedy book," she said. "It was originally a printed text. The margins are mostly mine now." "Can I see it?" he said. She had not been asked that before. She considered it for a moment, not defensively, just genuinely. The remedy book was private in the way that working documents were private. It was her thinking, her process, her wrong turns as well as her right ones. She reached into her satchel and handed it to him. He opened it carefully, with the respect of someone who knew they were being given something significant. He looked at the printed text, and then at her additions in the margins, the shorthand, the corrections, the additions that had grown from 4 years of observation. He turned a page. He read for several minutes. "This is organized differently from the printed text," he said. "I reorganized it as I went," she said, "by what I actually encountered in practice rather than by the theoretical order the author had used, which didn't match how problems actually arrived." He nodded slowly. "You could write this as its own book," he said. She blinked. "I'm a healer, not a writer." "You're currently writing," he said, gesturing at the remedy book. "Just not between covers." He handed it back carefully. "I'm serious." She took it. She looked at it. She had never thought about it as a book. She had thought of it as working notes, functional, temporary almost, always being added to and therefore never finished. But he had looked at it and seen something with a shape and a purpose that was already, in some form, complete. "My great-grandmother's annotations are still in these books," he said. 40 years after she died, that's because she wrote them down. Lyra held her remedy book. She thought about Grace's notebook, about the village women who had knowledge in their hands that no official record had ever captured, about the things that were lost when the people who knew them stopped being around to tell them. "I'll think about it," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to his history. She went back to her book. But she did not quite read it. She sat in the library in the winter afternoon light and thought about margins and what it meant to write things down so that they lasted. She thought about a woman she had never met who had argued with kings and been loved enough for it that someone had built her a room full of books. She thought about her own remedy book, dense with 4 years of what she had learned, and what it would look like in 40 years if it existed in some form that could be found. She looked at the man across from her who had looked at her working notes and seen a book. She thought, "Nobody had ever seen me that way before." She did not say that. She did not need to. But she held it, in the warm library in the last days before Christmas, and it sat in her chest like something that was going to grow. The Christmas feast was everything Helen had promised and more. The table was longer than usual and full from one end to the other with every member of the household who was available, from senior advisors to stable hands, to 3 of the kitchen children who were allowed to stay up past their usual hour for the occasion. The food was abundant and specific to the northern traditions. Dishes she had not tasted before, and 2 she recognized from the eastern territories, in slightly different forms. She sat at her usual place. Calum sat at his. But the usual formality of the shared dinners was suspended for the day, and the table was noisy in the way that tables were noisy when people allowed themselves to stop being professional at each other and simply be in the same room with enjoyment. She talked to Margaret, and to Nathan, and to Will, who had been allowed to attend, and who was visibly delighted about it. She ate more than she usually did. She drank a second glass of the dark northern wine. At some point in the middle of the evening, she looked down the table at Calum and found him already looking at her, and he lifted his glass slightly, not a toast, just an acknowledgement, and she did the same, and then they both looked back at their respective conversations. She went to bed that night feeling something she had not felt in years. Not happy exactly. Something more specific than happy. The feeling of being in the right place. Not the place she had chosen. The other kind. The place you find and then understand, slowly, was always where you were supposed to be. She thought about that for a long time in the dark. Then she slept. The January journey south was different from the one she had made in November. The difference was not the road, which was the same road, still difficult in winter though passable in the first 2 weeks of the month as Calum had said. It was not the cart, or Nathan's presence at the front, or the snow on the mountain shoulders to the north. The difference was the person sitting across from her. She had traveled with Calum before, technically, in the sense that they had been present in the same building for 4 months, and had attended the same events, and occupied the same spaces. But traveling meant something different. It meant 2 days of road, with nothing to fill the time, except the landscape, and whatever you decided to bring into the space between you. She had brought her remedy book. He had brought a folder of papers she suspected were territorial reports. They were both polite about the first hour, which was the hour of careful maintenance, and then the road had a particularly difficult stretch, and the cart lurched, and she put her hand out instinctively to steady herself against the side rail, and he put his out at the same moment, and they both caught the side rail at the same time, and their hands were briefly touching before they sorted themselves. She pulled hers back, he pulled his. They looked at each other for a moment, and then both looked at the road with a simultaneous deliberateness that managed to be funnier than either of them would have predicted. She heard him make a sound beside her that was the briefest, most controlled version of a laugh she had encountered. She looked at him. "You think that was funny," she said. "I think we were both very serious about the side rail," he said. She looked back at the road. "We were," she agreed. After that, the maintenance fell away. They talked. Not about anything in particular, about the road and the villages and the adjustments she had made to the training program, and a question he had about the winter illness patterns she had been tracking. They fell into the rhythm she recognized from their evenings in the library, the rhythm where conversation stopped being effortful and became something else. Nathan, at the front with the driver, had the tact to stay at the front. They arrived in Westmere on the afternoon of the second day, as the light was going flat and gray, and the snow was beginning again in a light, exploratory way. The village received them with the matter-of-fact welcome of a community that had been told they were coming and had organized accordingly. Several people were waiting in the square with the practical hospitality of people who knew that travelers needed warm food and a place to put their bags before they needed anything else. Grace was among them. She was a woman of about 35, with the squared shoulders of someone accustomed to doing more than was strictly easy, and the clear eyes of someone who paid attention. She looked at Lyra first, and something passed between them that was the recognition of two people who had been corresponding for 2 months about things that mattered. Then she looked at Calum. "You're the Alpha King," Grace said, not awed, noting a fact. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "I have things to show you." He looked at Lyra. Lyra almost smiled. Grace showed them everything over the course of the next 3 days. She showed them the treatment records she had been keeping since Lyra's first visit, which were meticulous and consistent. She showed them the community knowledge she had gathered, the informal network of women and older men who had been sharing health information for generations and who now had a point of contact and a framework and an actual name for what they were doing. She showed them the 2 cases Lyra had been worried about. Samuel was well, stubbornly and impressively well, and the woman with the lung condition had stabilized on the treatment Grace was managing. On the second evening, Grace showed Calum what the supply shortage had actually looked like. She did not dramatize it. She simply showed him the records she had kept during the 7 months, what had run out when, what she had substituted and why, what she had not been able to substitute, and what that meant for the people who needed those specific things. She showed him the pattern clearly, the way someone who had lived through something and then organized her understanding of it into something legible could show it. He read every page. He asked her 3 questions. The questions were good, and Grace answered them precisely. At the end she said, "It won't happen again?" "No," he said. "Not because of coordination failure." "Good," she said. "Because next time I don't know if the substitutions will work as well." "They won't need to," he said. Lyra watched this exchange and thought about the woman who had taught her daughter by example that caring for people was something worth doing, with rigor and consistency, and the willingness to learn. She thought about the records in that small notebook that she had copied by lamplight in November. On the 3rd day, she ran the first training session. She had designed the program in sections, and she delivered the first 3 here, with Grace as her primary student, and 3 other village women who had indicated interest as secondary participants. She had been good at teaching in the Eastern Territories, though she had not had many formal opportunities for it. She found she liked it, the specific challenge of taking something she knew thoroughly and presenting it in a way that another person could take hold of and use. Grace was exceptional. She grasped the framework immediately and asked the questions that revealed she was already thinking 2 steps ahead of the current section. Lyra adjusted her pace and went deeper, because the material she had built for a beginning student was not what Grace needed. Grace needed the intermediate version. She made notes about this in the margins of the training program. Calum came to the second half of the afternoon session. He sat in the back of the room on a low stool, clearly not wanting to take up space that belonged to the actual participants, and he listened. Not performed listening, actual listening. She could tell the difference by now. After the session, when the village women had gone home, and Grace was banking the fire, and Lyra was repacking her materials, Calum said, from the back of the room, "You're teaching her a different level than what you wrote." "She's past the written level," Lyra said. "She started with more knowledge than I expected." "Will you rewrite it for her?" "I already have," she said, and held up the margin-filled copy. "In my head. I'll formalize it tonight." He looked at her. "You adjusted in real time," he said. "That's what teaching is," she said. "You plan for the student you expect, and you adjust for the student who arrives." "Most people don't do that," he said. "Most people are teaching themselves," she said, "not the student." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she could not entirely read. "I'd like a copy of whatever you write for Grace," he said. "Why?" "Because the way you explain things," he said, "is the clearest I've encountered, and I want to understand what you're building here." She looked at him. She had been told she was good at things before. She had been told she was competent, she was effective, she was practical. She had been told these things by people who meant them as compliments, and she had received them as such. No one had said that the way she explained things was worth learning from. She had not known she needed to hear that until he said it. I'll have it for you by the time we leave, she said. They spent one more day in Westmere. She checked on the lung condition patient, adjusted the treatment slightly, based on what she observed, and left Grace with a full explanation of the adjustment and why. She checked on Samuel, who told her with great satisfaction that his joints had been considerably less troublesome this winter than the previous one, and attributed this to the dietary supplement she had prescribed, and also to the fact that his son had taken over the heavier work in the autumn, which was not a medical intervention, but was, Samuel noted with precision, not irrelevant. She left Grace with the amended training program, the full medical kit, and a letter she had prepared with the escalation protocols clearly laid out. She told Grace that she could write to her at any time, and would receive a response within the week. She told her that the second training session would happen in March, and she expected Grace to have worked through the entire current program by then. Grace accepted all of this, with the manner of someone being given tools she intended to use. On the last morning before they left, Lyra stood in the kitchen garden of the house where they had stayed, in the thin January morning, and felt the specific satisfaction of leaving a place better than you found it. Caleb came and stood beside her. Samuel told me, he said, that you were honest with him, about not being sure what you thought of me when you arrived. She looked at him. He told me not sure is better than no, she said. Something moved in Caleb's expression. He told me the same thing, he said, about you. She looked at the garden. The snow between the dormant beds was undisturbed in the early morning, pale and perfect and temporary. Are you still not sure? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. No, she said, I'm sure now. He was quiet for a moment. Of what? He said. She looked at him. That I'm glad I came, she said. That this, she paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to say it correctly. That this is mine, what I'm building here. You're part of what I'm building, and I wanted you to know that. She paused. I don't say things I don't mean. I know, he said. Good, she said. They stood in the garden in the January morning, and she was aware of how close they were standing, and she did not move away. She was done moving away. He looked at her. Lyra, he said. Yes, she said. I don't want to misread. You're not misreading, she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any of the elaborate architecture of a romantic gesture. He simply took her hand, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep, and held it. She held it back. They stood like that in the cold morning garden until Nathan's voice from the front of the house indicated that the cart was ready and it was time to go. She did not let go until they had to. The journey back was 2 days on the same road, and everything was different from the journey out. Not in any visible external way. The cart was the same, the road was the same. Nathan was at the front with the same tactful distance, but the space between them was different, less managed, more honest. They talked more freely than they had before, about the villages, and about what came next, about the library, and about the book she was maybe going to write, about Sela, and her Tuesday afternoons, and the spearmint plant, and the quality of her questions. On the second evening, at the inn where they stopped for the night, she thought about how much had changed since the November journey on the same road, how different the trip home felt from the trip out. She had arrived in the Northern Crown angry and organized and certain about the nature of the thing she was walking into. She was not those things anymore. She was still organized. She would always be organized. It was structural. But she was not angry, and she was not certain in the way that closed things off. She was certain in the other way, the way that opened them. She went to sleep that night in the inn room thinking about gardens, and held hands, and a man who had told her she was worth listening to in every way, except those specific words. She slept immediately, which was the sleep of someone who had been carrying something for a long time, and had, finally, set it down. They arrived back at the Northern Crown on a Friday afternoon, tired from the road, and carrying the specific kind of productive exhaustion that comes from days of good work. The palace received them with its usual quiet competence. Henry appeared within 2 minutes to take their bags. Helen appeared 3 minutes after that, with tea, and a list of things she felt Lyra should know had happened in her absence, which she delivered in the efficient and slightly aggrieved tone of a woman who had managed well, but wanted it acknowledged. Lyra acknowledged it. Helen's expression said she had accepted the acknowledgement and they were even. Edward came to her that evening with a question about the supply route for March that she answered from the notes she had kept on the journey. Nathan gave her the administrative portion of his report, which she looked over and returned with 3 observations, all of which he received with his usual attentive quiet. Margaret stopped by the practice room to say she was glad she was back, and also that her shoulder had been giving her trouble in the cold, and could Lyra look at it, which was Margaret's version of saying she had missed her. She looked at the shoulder, she adjusted the treatment. She was home. She let herself use that word, privately, in the quiet of her practice room after Margaret left. Home. It fit in a way she had not expected, and was not going to perform surprise about. That evening she was in the library. So was Calum. This was not unusual. But the way they were in the same room had shifted from what it had been before the journey south, and they were both adjusting to the shift, which happened in small and ordinary ways, a change in how they positioned themselves, the specific ease of the silence between them, the way she could say something and trust that it would land where she meant it. "I want to present the extended framework to the council next month," she said, "the model for all 17 outer settlements. Not all at once, a phased plan, but the full architecture." He looked up from his report. "How long do you need to prepare it?" 3 weeks, she said. 4 if I want it complete." 3, he said. "I'll tell the council there's an extended presentation. That gives them enough notice to actually read the background materials." "They won't read them," she said. "Some of them will," he said. "Lord Aldrich will. Claire will. That's enough." She looked at her book. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said, and then looked up with the slight expression. "I'm occasionally right." "Occasionally," she agreed. He went back to his report. She went back to her book. The fire was warm. The evening was long. She thought about what she had said in Westmere, that this was hers, that he was part of what she was building. She had meant both things, completely. She understood now, not managing her feelings about this man. She had stopped managing them sometime between the library in November and the garden in January, and the unmanaged version was not frightening. It was simply the truth of what was there, something she had built, slowly and with her whole careful attention, in the specific way she built everything. She trusted him. She had trusted him before she knew she did. That was the thing about trust built from evidence. It arrived fully formed once you had enough of the evidence, and then you looked back and saw the shape of it in all the moments that had preceded the recognition. She looked at him across the library. He was reading his report. His profile was familiar now, in the way that a person's profile becomes familiar when you have been sitting across from them in the same room for enough evenings. She knew the way he held his papers, and the way he went still when he was concentrating, and the way the lines of his face changed when something in the text surprised him. She knew him. That was new too. Knowing someone in the specific, detailed, unsentimental way that came from actual sustained attention over actual time. Not the knowing of a story, or a reputation, or a summary. The knowing of a person. She went back to her book. After a while he said, without looking up, "What are you working on?" "The framework outline," she said. "I started thinking about the structure for the council presentation." "Already?" "I'm efficient when something interests me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Does this interest you?" he said. "Not about the framework." She understood what he was asking. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Everything about this interests me." He held her gaze. "Good," he said. She went back to her outline. He went back to his report. The fire burned down. But something had been said in the room, clearly, in those 2 words, and neither of them needed to elaborate. The thing that had been building between them was acknowledged now, not declared dramatically, not arranged, simply acknowledged, in the way of 2 people who had been honest with each other about smaller things long enough that honesty about larger things was just the next step in a pattern. She finished her outline notes. She closed her book. She stood up and said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and she left the library and walked through the palace corridors to her rooms, with the particular feeling of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, and knows it. She sat on the edge of her bed. She was married to a man she had arrived expecting to endure. She was not enduring him. She let herself say it, fully and without hedging, in love with him. It had not happened on a single night, or in a single moment. It had happened the way everything real happened, in the accumulation of ordinary days, in kitchens and libraries and corridors and council rooms and small winter gardens in January, in arguments about maps and supply records, in 3 hours beside a sick child's bed, in the specific quality of his attention when she spoke. She was in love with him. She thought about the document her father had signed, about the carriage north, about the anger she had carried like a healer's satchel, packed and organized and always at hand. The anger was gone. She had set it down somewhere between Westmere and home, and she did not miss it. In its place was this, something real and specific and built of evidence, the same way everything she trusted was built. Evidence that this man was worth her, and that she was worth him, and that the wrong beginning of a thing did not determine its destination. She thought about Samuel's 43 years of complicated. She thought, yes. She got ready for bed. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling of her room in the Northern Crown, which was no longer an unfamiliar ceiling, but simply the ceiling of the room she lived in the home she had made. She did not take long to fall asleep. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday in late January. She knew it was from him before she opened it. The same red wax, the same Ashvale crest, the same weight in her hand of something that was going to require something from her. She broke the seal at her practice table, with Will's recently completed treatment record still on the desk, and the morning light coming in at the eastern angle she had come to know by heart. Her father wrote to inform her that the Ashvale family's political position in the northern region had been significantly strengthened by the alliance, which he appeared to consider news she would want to share in his satisfaction. He wrote to inquire after her adjustment, using that word in a way that suggested he considered adjustment a personal weakness she had probably been managing privately. He wrote to say that the family would be visiting the Northern Crown in late spring, a visit that had apparently been arranged at the diplomatic level without her knowledge, as he also mentioned, briefly and without apology, that he had spoken with the Northern Crown's council representatives about a secondary agreement between the Ashvale Eastern Holdings and the Northern trade routes. She read it twice. She set it down. She sat at her table for exactly 5 minutes, which was how long she allowed herself to feel the specific anger of it, before she converted it into what she needed it to be. Her father had made a secondary political arrangement, using the position her marriage had given the Ashvale family in the Northern Crown, through the council, rather than through Calum or through her, without telling either of them. She went to Calum. He was in the Eastern meeting room, with Nathan and 2 of his administrative staff, and she waited in the corridor until the meeting broke, and Nathan came out, and told her the Alpha King was available. She went in. Calum looked at her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face, which was very still in the way of his best and most controlled stillness. He read it a second time. He set it down. "He approached the council," he said. "Directly," she said. "Not through you." "Which 2 members?" She did not know. The letter had not said. Calum stood and went to the window. He stood there for a moment, and she could see him working through it. Not the anger, or not only the anger, but the calculus of what had happened, and what it meant, and what needed to happen now. "This isn't about the trade agreement," he said. "The trade agreement is real, and probably useful. This is about establishing that the Ashvale family has a direct line to my council." "Yes," she said. "Which means they can use your position here as ongoing leverage," he said. "Not just the initial marriage. The sustained relationship." "Yes," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her. "Did you know he was planning this?" he said. "No," she said, without hesitation. He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without shifting. "I know," he said. She understood that he meant he had not doubted her for a moment, that the question had been asked and answered in the same breath. "I'm going to address it with the council today," he said. "Whatever arrangement was discussed, it goes through me and through you for approval. Not around us." "Yes," she said. "Good. Your father will visit in the spring," he said. It was not quite a question. "Apparently," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Do you want to see him?" She thought about it honestly. "I want to manage him," she said, "which isn't the same thing." He nodded. "We'll manage him together," he said. That word, together. She felt it in the specific way she felt all the small and plain words he used, fully, without performance, as exactly what it was. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for this," he said. "This is ours, both of us." She left the meeting room and went back to her practice. She had patience in 20 minutes. She set the letter in the drawer with the small collection of difficult things, and she straightened her materials, and she was ready when the first patient knocked. She worked through the morning with the organized focus that had always been her best tool in difficult circumstances. She treated a cough and a recurring joint problem, and a young woman from the visiting merchant family who had been having persistent headaches for 3 weeks. She diagnosed, she prescribed, she documented. In the afternoon, Calum came to tell her what had happened with the council. He had met with Margaret and with Lord Aldrich, the two most senior members. He had discovered that the Ashvale approach had been made to a junior member, a man named Peter, who had received a formal diplomatic communication from the Ashvale Administrative Office, and had assumed it was routine coordination, rather than an unauthorized negotiation. Peter had been briefed on the correct procedure. The arrangement itself was not harmful. The trade agreement was, as Calum had said, genuinely useful. But it was now formalized through the correct channels, with the council's formal acknowledgement of what had happened, and how it would not happen again. Peter was embarrassed, Calum said, not incompetent. He made an assumption that wasn't unreasonable, given how the communication was framed. "My father is very good at framing communications to look routine," she said. "I know," he said. "I've read his previous correspondence. I should have anticipated this." "I should have warned you about his methods," she said. "I knew them. I didn't think far enough ahead." He looked at her. "We both missed it," he said. "That's not a failure. It's information. We won't miss it next time." She thought about her father reading a response from the Northern Crown that told him the arrangement was being formalized through proper channels. She thought about what that would tell him about the machinery here. She thought about what he would attempt next. "He'll try again," she said. "Of course he will," Calum said. "We'll be ready." She appreciated, enormously, the we. Over the next 2 weeks the matter settled into a managed state. The correct channels were in place. Edward had been briefed on the pattern to watch for, and the secondary trade arrangement moved forward under Nathan's oversight, in its properly documented form. Her father sent a short follow-up letter that thanked the Northern Crown for the expedited formalization, in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to having his end runs formalized right out from under him. She wrote back a brief response in her own name, not Calum's, not the Ashvale family's, but hers, acknowledging the follow-up and noting that she looked forward to the spring visit, and that all formal arrangements for the visit should be directed to her directly. She signed it with her full name in the style she had been using since she arrived, which combined both family names, which was her right, and which she had not used for years, because she had been avoiding the Ashvale Association. She used it now deliberately, because it meant something different now. It meant she was the Ashvale in the Northern Crown, not a representative of her father's agenda, the actual person. She gave the letter to Henry. Then she went to the library. Calum was there. He was not working. He was standing at the shelves, looking at the books, in the attitude of someone who was doing something between work and rest. He turned when she came in. "I sent my reply to my father," she said. He waited. "I used my full name," she said. "As the Northern Crown representative in any Ashvale matters." He looked at her. "He'll understand what that means," she said. "That I'm not a proxy for his interests here. That if he wants access to this kingdom, it runs through me, and I run through you, and we don't work in the way he's used to working." Calum was quiet for a long moment. "Is that a hard thing to do?" he said, to his family. She thought about it. "Harder than it should be," she said, "and not as hard as it would have been 6 months ago." "What changed 6 months ago?" "I started having things I wanted to protect," she said. He looked at her steadily. She had not planned to say it so directly. It had come out of her, the way true things came out when she stopped managing them, straightforwardly, without decoration. She held the look. "Lyra," he said. "Yes. I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it correctly." He paused, in the way of a man who was being careful with language because he meant it. "When you arrived, I told you the arrangement was practical. That it needed to function, that was true. But it was not. It is not what this is now. She waited. What this is now, he said, is the most important thing I've been given the chance to build. And I don't mean the kingdom. He looked at her. I mean this. You. She stood in the library with the evening light coming through the windows, and the fire going, and the room exactly as it always was, and she felt something move through her that was not quite one thing. Not relief exactly, though there was relief in it, and not surprise, though it landed in some part of her that had not let itself know it was coming, and not happiness exactly, though it was that too. It was recognition. He had just said what she had been thinking since January, the most important thing. I know, she said. Me too. He reached across the small distance between them, and she met him halfway, which was not a dramatic movement, just two people standing in a familiar room, close enough that the distance they had maintained for months was finally and simply gone. He put his hand against her face, and she leaned into it, and they stood like that for a moment, neither of them speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said. She was aware of the whole weight of the previous 7 months, the letter that had burned, and the carriage north, and the anger she had packed like a tool, and the evening in the library in November, and the southern garden in January, and every morning in Helen's kitchen, and every evening in this room. All of it led here, and here was not a dramatic ending, but simply the natural arrival point of the path they had been walking. She thought, this is what I built here. She thought, this was worth building. He looked at her. We have a council meeting tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. And you have patience in the morning. At 8, she said. So this is not the end of the day, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. They sat in the library for another hour. She worked on the extended framework. He worked on his report. The fire burned and the evening went quiet around them, and they were in the same room, in the specific way they had always been, except that the distance was gone, and in its place was something warmer and plainer and entirely ordinary, in the way that only the most important things managed to be. She did not think about what came next. She thought about what was here, in this room, on this evening, which was everything she needed for tonight. Tomorrow she would think about the spring visit, and her father, and the extended council presentation, and all the work that was waiting. She was not afraid of any of it. Tonight she sat in the library with the man she had married against her will, and loved without planning to, and she read her book, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the life she was living. February arrived with a stillness that the Northern Crown veterans said was the deepest part of winter, the season at its most committed, the most honest version of cold. Lyra had prepared for it. She had her patients on adjusted schedules, the heating in the practice room maintained at a level that was warm enough for examinations, the supply kits checked and updated for the specific conditions of the season. She had been in the Northern Crown long enough that winter was not a surprise anymore, but a thing she had planned for, which was different. The difference was small, but it was everything. She ran her practice. She worked on the extended framework for the council, which was taking shape in a way she was satisfied with, not just as a document, but as a system that would outlast her involvement in any single piece of it. She had written to 4 of the outer settlement contacts she had identified through Nathan's assessments, and 2 of them had written back with the kind of detailed, grounded information that told her there were more Graces out there, more people doing careful, invisible work that needed support rather than instruction. She was building something real. She had a conversation with Calum one evening about the remedy book, the book he had suggested she write. She had been thinking about it since the library in December, and she had come, slowly, to the conclusion that he was right. Not a formal medical text. Something else, a practical account of what she had learned, written for the people who were doing the work in the places where formal systems didn't reach. For Grace and the women like her. For the village healers and the careful informal practitioners who had knowledge that needed to survive them. I'm going to write it, she said. He looked up from the map he was consulting. Starting when? He said. Now, she said. In the evenings, around the framework work. In the margins of your remedy book, he said. No, she said. In its own pages. The remedy book is the source. This is the translation. He was quiet for a moment. What will you call it? He said. She thought about it. What she knew, she said. or something like that. What the women in the villages knew that no one wrote down. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had learned and valued, the particular quality of his attention when something landed exactly right with him. "That's good," he said. "It might take years," she said. "Most things worth doing do," he said. She started that evening. She took a clean journal from the shelf in her practice room, the kind she kept for extended notes, and she wrote the first line. She wrote about Grace. About the honey compresses that worked when the standard treatment wasn't available, and why they worked, and how Grace had learned them from old Mara, who had learned them from someone before her, and how that chain of knowledge had kept a woman alive through a supply shortage that should have been more dangerous than it was. She wrote for 2 hours. When she stopped, she looked at what she had written. It was not perfect. It was a beginning. Beginning was enough. The extended council presentation happened in mid-February. She had prepared for 3 weeks, and the preparation showed, not in the sense of an over-polished performance, but in the sense of knowing the material so thoroughly that she could respond to any angle of question without losing the thread. Lord Aldrich asked about the cost projection for all 17 settlements, which she answered with the specific figures she had prepared. Lady Clare asked about the quality control. How would she ensure that the people trained in the outer settlements were maintaining the standard over time, without constant oversight from the center? This was the question she had been most interested in. She described the network, not just a hub-and-spoke model with her at the center, but a web. Grace connecting to the 3 other women in the Westmere region, those women connecting to the villages adjacent to them, with a quarterly report system and an annual gathering she was planning for the autumn that would bring the outer settlement practitioners to the Northern Crown for a 3-day training exchange. Claire leaned forward slightly. "The annual gathering," she said. "That's not in the written framework." "It's new," Lyra said. "I added it after the January visit. I saw what Grace already knew when I arrived, and I understood that the knowledge flow needed to go both ways. I should be learning from them as much as teaching." Claire looked at her for a long moment. "You should propose this as a permanent institution," she said. "Not just a plan, a structured annual event with its own budget line." Lyra had not planned to propose that at this meeting. She looked at Calum. He gave her the briefest nod. "I'll prepare that proposal for the next meeting," she said. The vote was 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Lord Aldrich, who abstained not from opposition, but from the habit of wanting 1 additional quarter of data before committing budget to a new institution. Lady Clare voted yes. After the council, in the corridor, Margaret stopped her. "You've changed this place," Margaret said. Lyra looked at her. "Not just the medical access," Margaret said. "The way it thinks about itself. What it considers worth spending time and money on." She paused. "I've been on this council for 11 years. We have not done this kind of work before." "You didn't have a dedicated healer before," Lyra said. "We didn't have you before," Margaret said, with the precision of a woman who meant what she said, and did not say more than she meant. She thought about that as she walked back to her practice room. She had arrived here with nothing but her satchel, and her anger, and her 4 years of Eastern Territory practice. She had built a framework that was about to cover 17 settlements. She had found Grace. She was going to write a book. She had done all of that. She had also, alongside all of that, built something with Calum that she had not planned and had not known she needed, and that was now as central to her daily life as her work. Not instead of the work, alongside it. 2 things that were both fully themselves and that made each other larger. She sat at her practice table and looked at the clean pages of the book she had started. She wrote the second entry, about a man named Samuel and his joints and his 43 years and what he had understood about complicated things and why it was better than no. She wrote about what she had learned in the southern villages that no training program had taught her, about the specific way knowledge lived in communities and what it needed to survive, about the gap between the medicine written in books and the medicine practiced in kitchens and what bridged them. She wrote until the light changed. Calum found her there in the late afternoon. He looked at the pages she had covered and said nothing, which was sometimes his most expressive response. "It's coming," she said. "I can see that," he said. She capped her pen. She looked at him. She thought about where she had started with him, and where she was. About the Western study, with the practical terms, and the arranged space. About the map argument and the council meeting and the library in November. About a garden in January and what she had said there, and what he had said in the library, and how they had sat together since then, with the distance gone, and the ordinary texture of a shared life in its place. My father's visit is in late spring, she said. I know, he said. He's going to try to use me, she said, to get more from this kingdom than the arrangement already gives him. I know, he said. I'm not going to let him, she said. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. I want to be clear about something, she said, before he arrives and brings his version of reality with him. He waited. I'm not here because of his arrangements anymore, she said. I'm here because I chose to be. I want that to be stated clearly and on record between us, before we have to navigate him. Because whatever he thinks this is, whatever leverage he thinks he has, I want us both to know what we know. He crossed the room and sat across from her at the work table, which he almost never did. The practice room was her space, and he respected that boundary carefully. He sat across from her the way he had sat across from her in the Western study on the first evening she arrived, except that nothing else was the same. I know what we have, he said. I don't need my version of events adjusted by a man who signed a paper without asking you. She looked at him. And you? He said. What do you know? She thought about it, not because she wasn't sure, but because she wanted to say it fully. I know that I've built more here in 8 months than I built in 4 years anywhere else, she said. I know that I trust you. I know that what we have was built by us and belongs to us, and does not require his understanding or his approval to be real. She paused. And I know I love you. I haven't said it in those words yet. I'm saying it now, so it's said. He was very still for a moment. I love you, he said. I've known that since November. I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it. She looked at him. You were waiting, she said. You needed time, he said. That's not a complaint. I had time. She thought about November, and what she had been carrying then, about the careful management and the organized distance, and the anger she had worn like a coat against the cold of this unknown place. I'm ready, she said. I know, he said. She reached across the table, and he took her hand, the same way he had in January in the garden, the way he took hold of things he intended to keep. They sat like that in the practice room in the late February afternoon with her book pages spread between them, and the supply kit on the shelf, and the remedy book in its place, and everything she had built in 8 months of work around them. The spring was coming. Her father was coming. The council presentation was done, and the annual gathering was going to be proposed, and Grace was in Westmere doing her work, and the outer settlements were going to be mapped and served, and the book was being written. There was so much still to do. She was looking forward to all of it. Lord Goran Ashvale arrived in the Northern Crown on a Thursday in April, 2 weeks earlier than the date that had been arranged, which was the first thing he did. She was not surprised. She found out from Henry, who had received the revised arrival notice that morning, and brought it to her practice room, with the expression of a man delivering information he suspected was going to have consequences. She thanked Henry. She filed the information. She gave herself 5 minutes to think about it. Then she sent a note to Calum. He is arriving Thursday, not the 24th. Calum's reply came back in 20 minutes. I've seen the notice. Protocol has been adjusted. Do you need anything from me before Thursday? She wrote back. I'll let you know after I've thought about it. She thought about it through the afternoon and the evening. Not obsessively, but with the organized attention she gave problems that mattered. She thought about what her father was trying to accomplish with the early arrival, and what she would do about it. She thought about who she was now, versus who she had been when she left the Eastern Territories with her packed trunk and her organized anger. She was not afraid of him. That was new. She had always managed her father, managed her reactions to him, managed her exposure to him, managed the relationship with the careful distance of someone who knew a difficult thing and had learned to navigate around it. Management was not the same as power. She had spent years managing from a position of less. She was no longer in that position. She had authority here, real authority. Not the borrowed kind that came from being someone's wife, but the kind she had built herself from the practice, and the framework, and the council presentations, and the relationships she had forged in this palace and in the outer villages. She had standing, she had a record, she had a room full of people who would speak for her if she asked them to. She had herself. Thursday came. Her father arrived at the palace gates at mid-morning in the formal Ashvale traveling carriage, with 2 assistants and a senior Ashvale administrator named Frank, who she had met twice before and who was excellent at making things look routine that were not routine. She met him at the entrance. She was dressed formally, not elaborately. The practical version of formal that said she was taking this seriously without performing deference. Calum was beside her, which was correct protocol for the arrival of a family visit. Henry and Edward were behind them. This was not an accident of scheduling. She had arranged exactly this. Her father stepped out of the carriage. Goran Ashvale was 61, gray-haired, with the posture of a man who had spent 4 decades being the most significant person in every room he entered. He looked at her. He looked at Calum. He looked at the assembled staff. His expression did not change, which was its own communication. "Lyra," he said. "Father," she said. He embraced her in the manner of a man for whom embrace was a social transaction, rather than an emotional one. She received it in the same manner. "You're well," he said. This was also a statement, not a question. "Very well," she said. He looked around the entrance, with the assessing gaze of a man, calculating his position in a new environment. "The Northern Crown is impressive," he said, to Calum. "It works," Calum said, in the tone that she now recognized as meaning exactly what it said, and nothing more. Her father registered this, and filed it. She showed him to the guest rooms, the substantial ones, the ones that communicated seriousness without extravagance, which she had chosen deliberately. She gave him and his party an hour to settle, which was the correct hospitality, and also gave her time. She used the time to check on her patients, because 3 people had appointments that morning, and she was not canceling them for her father's visit. She treated a persistent chest cold in a guardsman, and reviewed a treatment response in a young woman from the palace kitchen, and told Will, who had invented a new transparent reason to appear, that his arm was fine, and he was welcome to come back next week with an actual complaint. She went to the afternoon meeting in the council room, where her father was to be received formally by the council as per the adjusted protocol. He was, she had to admit, very good at formal rooms. He sat in the visitor's chair with the ease of a man accustomed to being received, and introduced himself to each council member by name, with the fluency of someone who had done his research. He was pleasant with Margaret and respectful with Lord Aldrich, and appropriately deferential to Lady Clare. He was performing well. He kept looking at her. She met each look with the direct gaze she had learned from the northern rooms and the northern people. No deflection, no softening, just clear-eyed attention. After the formal meeting, the smaller group, her father, Frank, Calum, herself, and Edward, moved to the West meeting room for the practical discussions about the trade arrangement that had been formalized in January. This was the actual agenda item, the agreement itself, the terms, the implementation. Frank had a folder of documents. Edward had his own. The meeting was specific and technical, and she was in it as herself, not as background, not as her father's daughter, but as the Northern Crown's representative in matters touching on Ashvale family interests. She had cleared that role formally with the council, and Calum had backed it without reservation. Her father noticed. He noticed it in the way he noticed things, without visible reaction, with a slight adjustment of his attention that she recognized from childhood, the recalculation of where the power actually was. At one point he addressed a question to Calum about the implementation timeline. "Ask Lyra," Calum said. "She manages the coordination with the outer settlements that this affects." Her father looked at her. She answered the question. Fully. From knowledge. The meeting finished in an hour and a half. The trade arrangement was confirmed. Frank and Edward exchanged documents. It was done. Her father asked, afterward, if he could speak with her privately. She had been waiting for this. She took him to the library. It was the room she knew best in the palace, the room that was most hers, and she was not going to meet this conversation in unfamiliar territory. She sat. He sat across from her. "You've settled in," he said. "Yes," she said. "More than I expected," he said, which was as close as he was going to come to surprise. "What did you expect?" she said. He considered the question. "Management," he said, "of the situation." "I managed it," she said. And then I built something. He looked at her. He was, she had always known, intelligent. It was part of what made him difficult, because he was not careless. He saw what she had done here. She could see him seeing it. The outer settlement program, he said. That's yours. Yes. The council role. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I underestimated what you would do with the position, he said. Not an apology. Her father did not apologize, but an acknowledgement, which from him was more than she had expected. Yes, she said. You did. The secondary arrangement, he said. In January. I should have come to you directly. She looked at him. I'm telling you that, he said, because it's true, and because it won't serve the family if I repeat the mistake. It's not a concession. It's information management. She understood him. He was not reformed. He was recalibrating. The distinction mattered, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. If you communicate with this kingdom, she said, you communicate through me. If you have a request, or a proposal, or an inquiry, it comes to me first. Not the council, not a junior staff member, not a diplomatic channel I'm not part of. He looked at her steadily. That requires you to be responsive, he said. I will be, she said, within reasonable time frames. You will not find me a problem if you don't try to work around me. He was quiet for a moment. You're different, he said. Yes, she said. The man has something to do with it, he said. She looked at her father. I have something to do with it, she said. He happened to be someone worth the effort. But the effort was mine. Her father absorbed this. Your mother would have liked you this way, he said. She held that. It was the most personal thing he had said to her in years. She was not sure he had planned to say it. She let it be what it was without pulling at it. Thank you, she said. The visit lasted 4 days. She was present for all of it, but she was not subsumed by it. She ran her practice during the mornings. She attended the formal dinners. She showed her father the council framework for the outer settlements, not to seek his approval, but because it was part of what she had built, and she was done being small about what she had built. He was impressed. She saw it in the way he read the documents, with the same care he applied to things he considered worth his attention. On the final evening, her father sat at the long dinner table and talked to Edward about logistics, and to Margaret about council history, and to Will, who had shown up for dinner, with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of someone who had been told the Alpha King's father-in-law was coming, and had somehow constructed this into an occasion that required his personal attendance. She watched her father at the table. He was performing well. He always performed well. But he was also, she noticed, genuinely present in a way that was slightly different from his usual mode. Slightly less in his own head, and slightly more in the actual room. The Northern Crown had a quality of presence that was hard to fully perform against. Calum was across the table from her, talking to one of her father's assistants about a trade route. She caught his eye at some point, briefly, and he gave her the look that she now knew well. The one that asked, without words, how she was doing. She lifted her chin slightly. Fine, better than fine. He went back to the conversation. She thought about all the evenings at this table, all the ordinary evenings that had accumulated into this home, this life, this room full of people she knew and cared about, and was responsible for in some way. She thought about the treaty and the carriage north and the anger she had carried. She thought about how far away all of it felt. It did not feel like a different life. It felt like the beginning of this one. Her father left on a Friday morning. The carriage was loaded before dawn, and he came to say goodbye, with the efficiency of a man whose schedule was always full. He embraced her again, in the same formal manner. Then he said, very quietly, "You chose well. I don't mean the match. I mean what you did with it." She looked at him. "I chose to show up," she said. "Everything else was work." He nodded. He got into the carriage. Frank followed. The door closed. She watched the carriage move down the road, toward the gates. She stood, until it was out of sight. Calum came to stand beside her. "How was that?" he said. "Complicated," she said. "Good complicated, or bad complicated?" She looked at him. The edge of a smile, the thing she still gave him sparingly enough that it meant something. "Good," she said. "Complicated but good." He nodded. "What are you doing this morning?" she said. "Council reports until noon," he said. "You?" "Patients until 10, she said. "Then I'm going back to the book." "Good," he said. They went inside. She went to the practice room and checked that everything was ready for the morning's patients. She put the kettle on for tea. She sat at her long table, in her organized space, in the palace that had become her home. She looked at the remedy book on the shelf, at the new journal beside it, already thick with the pages she had filled, at the framed map on the wall, her own version, the one she had drawn herself over these months, with the 17 outer settlements marked, and the routes between them, and the names she had written in careful ink beside each marker. Will knocked at 8 o'clock. "My arm," he said. "Your arm is fine," she said. "My shoulder then," he said. "Sit down," she said. She examined his shoulder. It was, as she suspected, entirely fine, but she took her time about it and asked him the relevant questions and noted his answers in the patient record. She told him about a specific stretch that would help with the cold weather stiffness he described. She showed him how to do it. He did it incorrectly 3 times, and then correctly the 4th time, and she told him so. He left with the posture of someone who had been seen and helped and confirmed in their physical existence, which was what coming to the healer had always been about for most people, and she understood that, and she did not begrudge it. It was the work. All of it was the work, from the supply records to the council presentations to the Will who came every week on increasingly transparent pretexts. It was all the same thing, the work of keeping people well and treating them as worth the effort. She was good at the work. She was good at this life. After the morning patients, she sat at her table and opened the book. She wrote about the annual gathering she was planning for autumn, what she hoped it would look like, what she knew it needed to accomplish, what she expected to learn from the people who came, and what she expected to teach. She wrote about the 17 settlements and what she understood about each one so far, and what she still needed to find out. She wrote about the network of women who were doing this work in places where formal systems had never reached, and what it would mean to make that work legible, to give it language and record, and the permanence that came from being written down. She wrote for 2 hours. She stopped, not because she had run out of things to say, but because the afternoon was calling her back. There were records to update, and a letter to write to Grace about the March training session results, and a question Edward had for her about the autumn gathering budget. She closed the book. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the practice room. 8 months ago she had packed a trunk with 2 changes of clothes and her healer's tools and a remedy book and a thoroughly organized collection of reasons to be angry. She had gone north on a carriage into a life she had not chosen. She was still in that life, but it was hers now. Unmistakably, completely. In every room and corner and conversation of it, it was hers. She had built it. She had not built it alone. She thought about that difference. What it meant to build something alone, and what it meant to build something alongside someone who met you as a full person and expected the same in return. She had not known the difference until she experienced it. Now she could not unknow it. She picked up the letter she needed to write to Grace. Grace was doing excellent work. The most recent report she had sent was 14 pages, which was 4 more than the previous one, which meant she was finding more, and seeing more, and asking better questions. That was the sign Lyra had been watching for. Not the completion of the training program, but the growth beyond it. The point where the student stopped following the outline and started following the problem. Grace had reached that point. She wrote the letter. She told Grace that she was going to be invited to the autumn gathering and that she should plan to present what she had learned from the community network she had built, not as a report, but as a conversation, because the other practitioners would have built their own versions, and the gathering was about what they could learn from each other. She sealed the letter and gave it to Henry. Then she went to find Calum. He was in his study, which she now moved through without knocking, a shift that had happened gradually, and which she had noticed when she noticed she had stopped noticing it. She sat in the chair across the desk that had been hers since the first evening in the Western study, when she had come in with her organized anger and her readiness for battle. "I'm going to need someone to look at the autumn gathering budget before I propose it to the council," she said. "Edward," he said, without looking up from the map he was annotating. "I know, but you look at it first. I want your read on whether the timing is right to propose the institution formally, or whether we wait another year for more data." He looked up. "You're second-guessing the timing," he said. "That's not like you." "I'm being careful," she said. "It's like me." He set down his pen. He looked at her with the full attention he always gave her, the thing that had been one of the first things she had noticed, and had never become ordinary. "Tell me the hesitation," he said. She told him. It took 4 minutes. He listened without interrupting. "You're not second-guessing the timing," he said when she was done. "You're distinguishing between what you know and what you're inferring. That's different." She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "The council is ready," he said. Lady Claire's question about the annual gathering was not a caution. It was an invitation to make it formal. She wants this to be an institution. She'd have said so if you'd proposed it. "She doesn't say more than she needs to," Lyra said. "Neither do you," he said. She looked at him. "Propose it at next month's meeting," he said. "You have the data, you have the network, you have Claire. You're ready." She nodded. She stood up to leave. At the door she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. For the last 8 months." He looked at her. "You don't thank people for things they want to do," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with everything in his face that was usually carefully managed, and was not being managed right now. "Go write your book," he said. She went back to her practice room. She opened the journal. She wrote the next entry, and then the one after that, and then she lost track of the entries because she was in the middle of it, the middle of the work, and the middle of the day, and the middle of the life she had been building, sentence by sentence, patient by patient, village by village, evening by evening in the library, with a man who looked at her working notes and said, "You should write this down." The afternoon light moved across the floor of her practice room. Outside, the Northern Crown was going about its day, Helen in the kitchen, Edward in his records room, Nathan on his horse somewhere on the northern road, Will in the stable, Sella in the nursery, or perhaps on her way to the practice room for her Tuesday afternoon, which was, she just noted, today. Selah knocked at 3 o'clock. "Come in," Lyra said. Selah came in and sat on the corner of the table with the gravity of a 6-year-old who took her medical education seriously. "I have a question," Selah said. "Ask it," Lyra said. "Can people who aren't sick come to a healer?" Lyra looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Like," Selah said carefully, "if someone just wants to understand something about how bodies work, not because anything is wrong." Lyra set down her pen. "Yes," she said. "That's actually some of the most important work a healer does, teaching people what's normal so they recognize what isn't." Selah thought about this. "So I could come here and learn things." "You already do," Lyra said. "But more official," Selah said. Lyra looked at her. "You want to study medicine," she said. "Yes," Selah said. With the absolute clarity of a child who had decided something and was telling an adult, not asking. Lyra thought about what she had seen in Selah over these months, the questions, the attention, the way she had watched Lyra's hands on their first meeting with that focused wonder. The way she had lain in the bed with the high fever and chosen, out of all available responses, to look at the person who might be able to help and said, "Hello." "All right," she said. Selah's expression did something that was not quite a smile, but was the internal version of one. "Tuesdays," Lyra said, "and Thursday mornings. You'll start with the basics, the body systems, what they do, what they need. We go slowly, and we go thoroughly, and you ask every question you have." "I have a lot of questions," Selah said. "I know," Lyra said. "That's why you're going to be good at this." Selah absorbed this with the gravity it deserved. After she left, Lyra sat at her table in the late Thursday afternoon and looked at what was around her. The remedy book, the new journal, the map on the wall, the supply kit, the records, the tools in their leather roll. She had arrived in this place with nothing but these things and her own capacity. She had built the rest. She picked up her pen. She wrote,